All right, what's up, people? It's your boy Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse, and welcome back to another episode of the Black Muse podcast. Uh, I am not doing this solo dolo this time. I will probably later, but I got a guest, and I'm excited because this is a person I've been trying to get to come through on the podcast for a while. As is true of a lot of my other guests, this is somebody that I met on the social media, the social audio app called Clubhouse. It is a man by the name, and this is actually his real name, Bro. Bro,
Yo, what's
welcome
up,
to
everybody?
the podcast. How you doing, man? How you living? How you feeling?
I'm good, man. Feeling good,
Um,
feeling good.
so the first thing I gotta ask you is your real name, Bro?
That's my real name, man.
It's not like
Everybody,
an
it never
alias.
fails. No, it's literally on my driver's license, bro.
I'm gonna have a son. I'm gonna name him Bruh. Like, is that like Bruh? Like who stop calling my name? Like Bruh. Nah, I'm just playing.
It's
But
hilarious. It never fails. I meet people. That's
is
the
it?
first question. It's like, "What's your real
I don't
name,
think I've
bro?"
ever. I don't think I've ever met a person named Bro before. Is that? I assume it's uncommon. But I'm gonna ask. Is that
Yeah, for
common?
sure.
Is it uncommon?
No, it's totally uncommon. I only know
Okay.
one other person in the world called bro,
Okay.
um, and it
Do
happens to
you?
be my cousin.
Oh my God! The only two motherfuckers named Bro are related. Hell no, that's bro. What?
Yeah.
I didn't see that
Like a
coming.
distant cousin, but yeah,
Not distant enough. If y'all related and you're both
not
named
distant.
Bro,
I know, right?
some I don't know. So let's tell the audience where we know each other from.
Yeah, so we actually met on Clubhouse, um, probably like a year ago or so, maybe a little over a year ago, and yeah, we just ended up in I don't know if we met in your room or if we met in some random room and then we collaborated. Ended
Mhm,
up in your room or you ended up. I don't remember how it happened. Everything tends
mhm.
to be a blur on this app called Clubhouse, but. Yeah, we just we met on Clubhouse, start having conversations centering on various topics, everything from race to the whole trans movement to all this other stuff that's going on in society today.
Yeah.
And one of the conversations we've had is about like disparate impacts, reparations, all this other stuff. So
Mhm.
today is another topic.
Don't get ahead of me. Don't bury the lead. Don't do that. But no, we did. So for those who don't already know, so Clubhouse is the name of a social audio app, and it allows you to create what are called rooms, not actual literal rooms, but they're like social or virtual rooms. And you go in there and you have like a little picture for your profile, and you can have conversations with people, almost like a conference call or a web call. Um, and they have clubs, and the clubs are usually thematic in nature. So like you can have a club that's dedicated to all like Laker fandom. You have other clubs dedicated to discussing politics. You have clubs dedicated to talking about fashion and all that kind of stuff. And so that's what he means by we met in my room. He didn't mean that literally. I don't want people to think that he came
That's a good
physically into my
clarification.
actual room. It's like I don't know what kind of like social thing they talk about, but like they met in some kind of a house, and he went into his room. It was weird. It was awkward.
And they had weird conversations.
They had conversations with some trans people. I heard. I don't know what's going on. I heard Jason lives in San Francisco. It's wild. But yeah, like so social. But the thing is, Clubhouse, because it caters to people talking. The main modality is you talk, you use your voice, and that's different from tweets and Facebook posts and things like that. And so if you're a talker like me, that's something that you gravitate towards. And the reason why I even got into doing this podcast because a lot of people are that are on there are content creators and podcasters and stuff like that. And so they started saying, maybe you ever thought about doing a podcast? I'm like, no, I'm not here for that. I'm here because I'm stuck in my house because of COVID and I'm bored and I just want to talk to people. That's really how it started. And so now I'm doing a whole podcast. I like it. It's fun. And now I'm leveraging kind of the relationships that I built with people on Clubhouse to have them as guests. So that's how you're here. That's one of the reasons why you're here. Last thing I'm gonna say before we get into the subject proper is, where are you originally from? Because I think it's
I'm
going to be
originally
relevant later.
from Kenya,
Did
East
you grow
Africa.
up there, or
Yeah,
did you immigrated when you were young?
I was 12,
Okay,
so
so then you
um,
remember that you remember moving,
so I
right?
remember everything. I'm trilingual, so I remember all my languages. Um, and 12 is an interesting age because you get to remember everything, but you also are able to adapt at such a high rate versus someone who comes in at 15, 16 years old. So,
Did you
like
learn
my
English?
sisters,
Did you learn English in Kenya?
I did.
Is that one of the what are the official languages in Kenya?
So English is the official language of the country.
Yeah, I
We
didn't want
were
to
a
say that and be wrong, but I felt like I heard
Yeah,
that before.
yeah. So we were a British colony. We got independence in 63, and upon independence, English became the official language of the country. So any like business organization, it's the official business language, official language in the country. The national language, though, is Swahili, right?
Do
So
you
that's
speak?
what unifies everyone, regardless of tribe. So I speak that. Every Kenyan speaks that. And then you have tribal languages. You have like 42 tribes in the country, a little bit over 60 languages throughout the entire country. So, but everyone speaks Swahili, and then everyone has their own, tribal
Mhm.
language. So mine is
Does
Kikuyu.
do you know? Happen to know? This is random. This is just my mind just made this connection. It has nothing to do with you. Do you happen to know if Barack Obama can speak Swahili? Because I think he was born in Kenya, but I think he moved
I'm
to where he lives.
100% certain he can't.
He can't or he can.
No, no, cannot.
Okay, because he
No.
moved so young.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the thing is that if you move when you're young, especially if you move after 12 years old, the likelihood of you being able to keep your language is dramatically lowered.
Yeah, it makes
So,
sense.
seeing that Barack Obama didn't spend majority of his childhood in Kenya, um, it just goes to show, unless he had like someone to speak Swahili to him every single day, wherever he moved to, whether it's
I
Hawaii
think he moved
or
to Hawaii
yeah,
for
right.
most of his
So
formative years. Okay, I was just this is a my brain just made that connection. It was just random. It doesn't have much to do with it about anything. I was just curious
yeah,
if
it's
you knew.
all good.
Like, do you keep tabs on every Kenyan that ever existed everywhere?
Yeah, some people crazy like that. Like, I have a friend, his name is so and so. Do you know him? I'm like, no.
Not why the fuck would I know him, bro? You know how big Kenya is? How big is Kenya, by the way?
Kenya is a little bit bigger than Texas, so
Okay, yeah, that's
it's
pretty
it's
big.
uh it's sizable. It's about
Texas is the
45, 52 million people.
second or third biggest state. Alaska's the biggest. I can't remember if Texas is bigger than California though. I think California is the second biggest, and Texas is the third biggest in the United States. If I'm not mistaken. I
Yeah,
could be wrong though.
Alaska's number one. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Alaska's one, but California is either two or three. And I always forget which one is between Texas and Cali, the next two. But anyway,
Yeah.
all right. So let's get into the subject proper. So, and actually, bro and I have had this exact argument, debate back and forth, this topic several times on Clubhouse. And the last time I was really annoyed with you because you were acting like you had never heard these things before, and I was just like, bro, like we've had this discussion before. Stop pretending like you ain't never heard this shit. But the subject proper that we're going to discuss is whether or not there is ongoing anti-black systemic racism currently in the United States in 2022. What is the extent of it, if there is such a thing? What does it look like, etc.? My contention is going to be that there is such a thing, and that the leftists who talk about forms of systemic racism or oppression that negatively impact black people are not making it up. I presume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that bro, you're going to take the opposite of that. But what is your stance before we begin?
Yeah, my stance is that in the United States right now, what people refer to as systemic racism, um, is, if it does exist, is on life support. It is at such an inconsequential level that it doesn't determine people's in terms of general categories. It doesn't determine their success or failure. So I don't think that systemic racism, as it pertains to being anti-black, so against black people, I don't think that exists today in America. If you look at virtually every major category in the country, and the way people do it is they look at disparate impact. There is no category category where a majority people, Black people specifically, are negatively impacted due to the American system. Um, you may find one or two, but you will find that the causal factors of those things are personal life choices, not systemic codified laws. So to me, if we look at the different systems that exist in America or the different conditions that Black people in America are living through, you will find the majority of them are actually doing just fine, if not excelling.
What do you mean just fine? Like they're not starving to
So
death and stuff?
so you'll hear people say that Black people are, but they look at the disparity of income or wealth between Black people and white people, and they say, well, Black people are X amount as much to be poor or X amount as much to be uh, not wealthy as white people, or Black people make X amount to their white counterpart. And what I'm saying is that if American system is quote unquote systemically racist as it pertains to like income, then we would see that majority of Black people would in fact be poor. But what we actually see is the reverse. Majority of Black people in this country don't live in poverty. Majority of Black people in this country don't live in the ghettos. Majority of Black people in this country are not just getting by. Okay, majority of Black people live in suburbs. Majority of Black people, actually, Black people have a higher per capita income than Hispanics. They do have a lower per capita income or lower household income than Hispanics, but that's because, again, lifestyle, personal choices. Hispanic people tend to have more people per household, so they have a greater household income. So, if America's failing Black people, then why is it that most Black people are falling through the cracks?
Most Black people are falling through the cracks or are not.
So if the American system is systemically racist against Black people, right? Think of it like this: if you build a company, let's say a car company,
Mhm.
if majority of the cars that go through the assembly line are faulty and they're getting recalled for all sorts of stuff, then you have
Mhm.
an unsuccessful car company, correct? Because it's
Mhm.
like majority of your product is failing. So that's
Mhm.
an unsuccessful venture. Same thing with every other category. If you build a school, majority of people don't graduate, it's an unsuccessful school, okay? Because it's not
Mhm.
bringing out positive outcomes for majority of people who go through it. So the same thing applies to the American system. When it comes to poverty, we know that majority of Black people aren't poor, which means that majority of Black people have figured out not to be poor, how not to be poor, regardless
What
of
percentage
whatever the system you may.
what percentage of Black people in America do you think live below the poverty line?
I believe the number is 19.5, so it's sub 20%.
I'm looking at it right now. 19.5% as of 2021. So just under 20%. But Black people are only 13% of the population,
Yeah,
right? So they're disproportionately high by comparison to their percent of the population.
but that means nothing though,
Well, it
So
means something. It's one way to get at the disparate
it doesn't
impact.
mean anything. The reason why it means nothing is because simply you don't just juxtapose things based on percentage of population. Like, what if Black people, for example, had no interest in playing hockey? Would we say that they're disparately impacted? They're systemically oppressed from playing hockey because they make up a very small percentage of the hockey players? No, we just say, well, first, we haven't accounted for interest. How many Black people want to play hockey, right? So just
Well,
because you show up,
what percentage of the Black population is not interested in living above the poverty line?
I would venture to say that no one is interested in living below the poverty line. But that doesn't
No, no.
mean
Well,
that people.
okay, you answered my question, but accidentally. So the way I asked it was, what percentage of Black people do you think are not interested in living above the poverty line? But you answered my question. But the only point I was making was we don't really need to adjust for interest because intuitively, like anybody who's sane does not want to live in poverty, right? Now you may have people
Mhm.
who may passively accept living in poverty because they've given up on their prospects of changing that. But I think if you gave everybody a choice between, hey, you could be broke or you could like not be broke, I feel like the vast majority of Black people would be like, well, I'm gonna choose to not be broke.
Yeah,
Right?
but
Like
life isn't
we agree on
about
that.
just like Yeah, but life doesn't just hand you a choice, like, do you wanna be rich or poor? Like, if that was the choice and it was just automatic based on your decision, then yeah, we wouldn't be here debating about, why people are poor or why people are rich. It would be just like, well, some people chose to be poor, some people chose to be rich, But the reason these realities exist is because something happens after the choice. There's interest, but
Well,
just because
okay,
you have
but
an interest doesn't mean.
the only point I was making is it kind of undermines your analogy because you were trying to say that like in other domains where we account
Mhm,
for things like interest, right? Like hockey, for example, if we notice that black people are disproportionately they're disproportionately less likely to go into, I guess, hockey, but
yeah,
the primary reason for that is because they're not interested in going into hockey. Then we wouldn't say that that was necessarily like an example of systemic racism. And I actually agree with that. But what I was trying to point out was that kind of explanation would not analogously apply to poverty because we don't have a bunch of black people who are interested in becoming impoverished or who are not interested in being able to make ends meet, right? So that's what I'm saying is
yeah.
awkward about that comparison.
Yeah, I would say that some people are actually interested in maintaining their poverty. As controversial as that might be,
That's
the
that's
reality
a
is
hot
this,
take.
right? It
It's
is
a
a
hot
hot take, but here's the thing, right? We know that some people in society, regardless of how great society we create, there's always going to be people who make bad, horrible decisions for themselves.
mhm.
Okay? It's not that they're, and these are not like, mentally disabled people who can't make better decisions. These are people who are functional enough to make choice A, which would be positive for their life, versus choice B, which would be detrimental to their life. Yet they choose choice B. Regardless of whatever environmental circumstances that there may be, their choices are still being made. So to me, and that doesn't assume that other people in other realms don't have environmental factors that inform their decisions as well. So my example as it pertains to interest is that there are some people who simply aren't interested in becoming uh, wealthier than the next guy. Some people are complacent at the middle class. Some people are complacent at slightly below middle class. Some people are complacent at just higher middle class. Some people are never complacent. So there's different classes of people with different interests, and it is a difficult thing, I will admit, to kind of gauge the interest the interest rates of different groups of people. But one of the metrics we can use is looking at the choices that they make as it pertains to what brings about the incomes that they would generate. So fields of study is one. So, okay, what fields of study do Black people predominantly go into versus their other racial counterparts? And that kind of informs us on what kind of fields that they will end up in and what incomes are warranted by the fields that they do end up in. And then we can backtrace and see, well, okay, Black people are saying that they're making X amount as college graduates, but have we accounted for the different majors that they went into versus their other counterparts? So,
I mean, so I think the ultimate point that you're trying to make, to be fair to you, is that we need to account for different factors in order
yeah.
to be able to tell whether or not one of the biggest contributing factors was, uh, I guess, systemic racism or racial prejudice generally. Um, Although those are going to end up being distinct things when I end up defining them later. To be fair, but here's what I want to start because this is something that I just looked up while you were speaking.
Yeah.
So this is from KFF,
Hmm.
and this the most recent data that they have is 2019, so it's 3 years old.
Yeah.
Um, but this is poverty by race. Okay, so in the United States, those who are living in poverty who are white is just 9% of the population. It's 21.2% of the black population, 17.2% of the Hispanic population, 9.7 Asian, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, 14.9% are multiracial, right? And then the overall total, the baseline for the entire United States is for all racial groups, 12.3% is living below the poverty line. Yet white people make up something like 60% of the population, black people 13. I forget exactly what Hispanic was. I gotta look
17%,
that up.
almost 18 right now.
Okay, we'll take your word for it. I don't know
Yeah,
what Asian Pacific is, but I think it's like really small, like
yeah.
4% or something.
I know
I don't,
Asians are
but
like
don't
3.
quote me
Yeah.
on that. So the reason why they use those baselines of the percent of the population is because if it were truly random and it was not impacted by race at all, you would expect it to reflect the percent, or at the very least, to be equal to what it is across the board for all racial groups. So it'll be right around here, 12.3%,
So who uses
maximum.
it? You said the reason why they use uh percentage of
The
population. Where are
the
they
as a
using it as a
benchmark,
juxta?
it's a
Yeah.
common it's a common it's a common thing to use in just statistical analysis generally. That's one of the most common benchmarks that people use when it
I
comes
know it's a
to
common thing that people
demographic
use.
trends.
Yeah, I know it's a common
But
thing
I'm
that
not I'm
people
not just
use
talking
when
about
looking at
random people though.
discriminant,
I
right?
mean like scholars. I mean like people who like actually do demographic data on a regular basis and for various different reasons. But they break down various different domains of society in terms of racial demographics and other demographics as well.
Yeah, but the problem is, and that's the reason why I interjected and said it means nothing, is because you can have a group of people that makes up the majority being a minority of a whole category or non-existent, but it shows zero discrimination in that field. For example, you can
Okay,
have
well then wait, but just before you, so then what would be the explanation for why white people are the least likely statistically to be in poverty?
okay. Yeah,
Because
so
it's not going to be interests.
well, that's part of it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we have to look at
No,
yeah, we have to
wait.
look at
We've
the
already established that interests are not part of it because nobody's interested in living in poverty.
No, no, no,
It's
no, no,
like
no, no.
very, very
So
rare
that's not
to
the
find a
interest we're
person who's
talking about. We're talking about the interest in terms of the decisions that people make. So everyone is interested in becoming rich, but how many people do what it takes to become rich? Everyone's interested in owning a business, or interested in having a great family, but how many people end up having great families? So simply because you want a particular outcome doesn't mean that you will get particular outcome. There
I
are
think
there
I
are
get
other
that, but
variables
that
in
doesn't
play.
explain explain the racial disparities in the outcome of not living in poverty, though, right? Because what you're implying is that the reason why Black people and Hispanic people are statistically way more likely than by comparison to their white counterparts to live in poverty is because they're not doing the right things that they need
Yeah,
to do. Like that's what you're implying, and
that's what I'm saying.
what I'm fundamentally going to argue against is that because that doesn't seem to make sense either. There
Yeah,
are Black people and there are Hispanic people, to be fair, who make poor decisions and
of
that
course.
negatively impacts their life prospects.
Hmm.
But like to what I think you're about to commit the mistake of doing is blaming all of the instances in our society where Black and Hispanic people are living in poverty on choices that they've made and not taking into account all of the things that had nothing to do with their choices that negatively impacted their life prospects. So, for example, just as an anecdotal example, right? Like be, being born and into it and living in certain neighborhoods in the country can negatively impact your life prospects because
Hmm.
they're connected with a scarcity of resources that are vital for you to be able to make it,
Okay.
like educational resources, like your ability to like have 3 square meals a day, and all of the other things that come with living in conditions of poverty, whether the streets that you live on are unsafe, etc. Right?
Okay.
Like those are not those people being born into those situations are not the actions of their choices. Now they may be the confluence of choices other people made, like their parents, but that's not like that's not the direct product or consequence of their own choices. And I can't. And if I'm born into a situation like that, there's nothing that I decided that made my parents make the amount of money that they make. There's nothing that I decided that makes it whether that determines whether or not the street I live on or the neighborhood I live in is riddled with gangs and drugs and things like that. There's nothing about the choices that I made that made the conditions in which I live that impact my reality and impact my life prospects. They impact what I learn, what I pick up. They impact my conception of myself. They impact um, they impact me in terms of like creating temptations to fall into the quote unquote traps or poor decisions that you're talking about all of that stuff. They impact me in so many ways that it would be weird to blame that on my choices.
Yeah, so I'm not blaming everything on the choices of that individual in their particular circumstance. What I am blaming is personal choices in general. What we're arguing is whether systemic racism is what's causing these outcomes. And you gave an example of poverty being the causal factor, which leads to poor resources that lead to poor outcomes, right, for people. So the argument is not, oh, the reason why they have these poor outcomes is because they're black. The argument is, oh, they have these poor outcomes because they were poor. Because then, and if that's the argument, then it's like, okay, well, if Hispanic people who are poor, or Asian people who are poor, or white people who are also poor, would have similar outcomes in their demographics in terms of their outcomes. And what we see is that there's a disparity in life choices, even amongst poor people. So, for example, you look at New York City, and a quarter of all the Asians, specifically Chinese Americans, who live in New York City, live below the poverty line. A quarter of them. Okay, it is a higher percentage than Black people poverty rate in New York City. Yet
Mhm.
the violent crime of Black people in New York City is dramatically higher than that of Asian Americans in New York City. So the inference that we just have bad outcomes because people are poor also doesn't hold weight across the board. There are choices that people,
But
there's
that's not what I
prerequisites of
argue.
culture. Yeah,
That's
right.
not what I argue.
But your argument is that, hey, we can look at neighborhoods in the United States, like poor neighborhoods, and they have like poor, bad, worse schools. They don't have as much resources, which means the kids are disproportionately affected because of like poorer talent and teacher selection and all this stuff, right? And then you
Mhm.
have these bad outcomes, which
Mhm.
I can agree. Yes, you do have worse outcomes when you have, on a general scale, you tend to have worse outcomes when you have worse resources, right?
Mhm.
But what I'm also
Mhm.
arguing is that my whole argument is we have to look deeper. We just have it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction the moment we see a disparate impact among racial lines, and we jump to racism as being the first thing we're going to jump to as it being the causal factor. And all I'm saying is that in order for you to make that argument, you have to provide hard evidence that that is the case, and you have to account for all the other variables.
Okay, fair enough. But I am in the process of methodically pointing out all or establishing that evidence. I haven't gotten to my definitions yet because I keep trying to present my facts kind of in correspondence to things that you're saying. So they're not necessarily in the order I would have picked. But I think this is a better way to do it and still um, keep a certain amount of fidelity to the natural organic conversation. So one of the things
Okay.
that I want to present to respond to what you just said is you just evoked the idea that poverty was the cause of these bad outcomes, not systemic racism. And one of the things I'm going to do in this phase of the conversation is I'm going to begin a process that I anticipate is going to be a long one because I feel like you're going to fight me every step of the way, like you usually do, of trying to get you to see that all of the things that you are already admitting are contributing factors to these negative outcomes are precisely what
Mhm.
people are talking about when they talk about systemic or structural racism. That's what they mean. So they're
Okay.
talking, but because these things are built into the structures or the systems in our society, right? So like scarcity of resources, dilapidated housing, which from which you collect less taxes, which means you have less of a pool to fund schools, which means these schools tend to be less attractive to the most formidable teachers and administrators, etc. All of these things work together systemically, and they're built right into the structure of our society. Now we're talking about a lot of localized things, but we could actually, if we wanted to, expand this out to less local things and more broad things, statewide, federal, etc. Right? Like these are the things that contribute to the conditions under which people live, that contribute to the menu of options that they have to even choose from in the first place. And then to demonize them for making bad choices when a lot of the choices that they had to choose from were all fucked up anyway. Or if they had made the quote unquote right choices, meaning not choosing criminality, for example, not choosing to sell drugs, not choosing gang violence, etc., right? Then those alternatives to those, I guess, stereotypically bad choices. One of the reasons why they don't look so attractive to people who live under those conditions is because it's really, really difficult to like live a comfortable, non-impoverished life choosing those alternative means. If you're just gonna like stick to school in a lot of these different neighborhoods when the schools are subpar, like your chances of making it out of poverty don't seem that promising. But if you sell drugs for a living until you can get your mixtape out and you try to replicate a formula that a lot of other niggas in the hood that you model yourself after have done to get them out, your Jay-Z's, your Snoop Dogg's, etc., right? Like a lot of people make these choices that you may say are bad choices or are traps motivated by, I think, a fairly fair analysis of what all the choices are. And because they don't have the same choices on their menu of options as a lot of other people who live in a lot better conditions, right? Like we have to acknowledge that yes, they're making bad choices, but they're making bad choices under certain conditions that are maximizing the likelihood that those bad choices are going to look more appealing than they otherwise would. And that's a confluence of personal responsibility, which I know you want to emphasize, and systemic structural factors, which is what I'm trying to get you to see, because you seem to want to put it all in one bucket and you don't want to acknowledge all of this stuff. What do you say to
Yeah,
that?
I don't see the systemic nature, because there's a point in time where Black people had worse systemic problems, yet better outcomes. Okay, in terms of like drug dealing, in terms of ending up in prison, in terms of single motherhood, like all these things were at a lower rate when Black people were actually experiencing real systemic racism codified in law. They couldn't argue against it. But now we have a situation where we have to try and find systemic racism in different fields because there's so many other confounding variables that must be accounted for. And so my argument
But
is not that there couldn't be any systemic. I'm not talking about systemic racism. There's systemic things in, like, say, a ghetto that could cause you to end up drug dealing. The argument, though, is that that's not systemic racism. That's just a systemic culture that you found yourself in, and you're now resorting to actions or decisions that may be evaluated as being outside of your control. Okay, but at the end of the
but the
day,
systemic, go ahead.
yeah, but at the end of the day, you know, these people come from families, and these families were built off of family decisions, off of individual people's decisions. And you, if you
Well,
don't build a strong family unit, strong family structure, you cannot reasonably expect to end up with better outcomes for the kids that come out of those units than in other places that they have better family structures built.
I mean, so the importance of the family, I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir. I would never argue that the family structure is not important. I'm not one of those. Um, I would consider them radical leftists that make it seem as though the
Hmm.
family is not that big of a deal. However, even the strength or stability or lack thereof of a family unit is impacted by
Yeah.
by a lot of the same systemic forces, right? So like families live in these conditions of poverty too, and and a lot of times a lot of these cycles of poverty are perpetuated by the fact that these families are broken. And part of the contributing factors of what breaks these families, what ends up separating people who otherwise would be in a solid family unit, are the conditions
Hmm.
of poverty in which they live, are the drive-by shootings that happen and that takes family members out of the home, are the arrests that are made, and sometimes ridiculous ones like mere possession of weed, which takes a father out of his home where he would be very useful in keeping his family together and raising his children, but puts him in prison for no reason, right? Just because he had too much marijuana on him, right?
Hmm.
For example, um, etc. And that's not to downplay the very poor choices that some people make who live in conditions of poverty, right? I think the person who decides to get in his car and shoot somebody because they live in the wrong neighborhood is making a bad choice, to be fair, right? And they don't necessarily have to do that, right? And a lot of it is not arbitrary in that way. A lot of it is motivated by, you know, turfs that have to do with like whether or not you can like distribute your drugs, which is tied to your economic ends, which is tied to your ability to make ends meet. So it's motivated in a lot less arbitrary and capricious ways. But sometimes you do have these kind of like this honor culture manifests itself of like such and such a person disrespected me, so I'm gonna go pop a cap in his ass on some thug shit. Like, so that happens too, and these are poor choices in my opinion. I would agree with you, right? But like these things are cyclical, partly because of the structural elements that we have. Like, what are the reasons why? What are all of the causal mechanisms by which Black and brown people get concentrated in urbanized ghettos, right? And that history goes way before, long before 2022, right? The history of those trends, and those trends are systemic in nature. They're structural in nature. Denying Black people at a systemic level, like systemically or uh, what consistently, from being able to buy certain properties in certain areas that we're going to appreciate and value either at a faster rate or to a way larger extent than other areas where they end up basically renting. um all of that kind of stuff, predatory lending practices, all that kind of stuff, all of that stuff contributes to the conditions under which Black and brown people live in this country. And so like that's got to show up in your analysis historically
Yeah,
about what's giving
but
rise to these trends. And if you can't, hold on, well, I'm almost done. And if you can't take those things, those causal mechanisms into effect, and you're just going to blame people for making bad decisions, then to me your analysis is going to be summarily incomplete. Go ahead.
yeah, so my argument, my thesis from the start was that systems are built to affect the majority of people who go through them in a positive light or in a negative light. That's the point of a system. If
Well,
you're
but
if you,
some
the
but
point of a
some
system,
systems. Go ahead.
if you build a system, you don't want majority of people falling through the cracks. Otherwise, you have a very incoherent and dysfunctional system.
Yeah,
But
ideally.
we find ourselves arguing over categories or over a system that advantages the majority in every instance, or in virtually every instance. When it comes to uh, imprisonment, when it comes to income, living in the ghetto versus living in suburbs, majority of Black people are in the positive end of those things. Okay, majority of Black people aren't in prison. Majority of Black people are not in the ghettos. Majority of Black people aren't poor. But I mean, we could focus on the small minority of Black people who do end up living in ghettos, who do end up being poor, who do end up in these negative outcomes, and we can evaluate, well, why are they in these circumstances? And your argument is, well, we have to look at the foundations of these things, and some of the foundation is systemic racism. And I'm arguing
Mhm.
that no, it is not. It is not at all.
Well,
Because if
how
I
could
can
it not
find
be?
a situation, right? So look at 1940 in the United States. Poverty rate for Black people in 1940 was 87%.
Do you have facts to
Okay.
back this up? I want to show the
Yes.
audience.
Yes.
You want
So
to you want me to show
you
your
can
thing?
just well, let me see. I could probably Google it for you. I didn't pull up that particular stat, but the poverty rate, I know these numbers verbatim. Poverty rate for Black people in 1940 was 87%, and just 20 years later, 1940 to 1960 was 47%. Okay. You can check it out if you want. Um, so you have
Well, I would
the
like for you, if you
great,
wouldn't mind, I would like for you to pull up so I can show the audience.
sure, sure. Poverty
You can
rate.
keep talking and take your time. As long as you show it at some point, I'm good.
Yeah. So you have the greatest deceleration, and I literally typed in Google poverty rate Black in 1940, and it pulls up 87%. Okay. Um,
Mhm.
so you could share my tab here. Let me see. I have a tab open. I can just share it with you. Oh, so this is what I'm looking at right here.
Okay.
All right. And it says here in 1940 to 47% by 1960. Okay. So you had a massive deceleration of poverty in Black America from 1940 to 1960, arguably one of the most racist periods in American history. Okay. This is
Mhm.
before the civil rights movement. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. This is before affirmative action. This is before all these things that were supposedly great advancements of Black people in this country. So what I'm arguing is the simple reality that if I can point to a time period in this country where it is inarguable that Black people were facing greater codified systemic oppression, okay, yet Black people at the same time were experiencing better societal outcomes in terms of, say, marriage rates, in terms of children not being born out of wedlock, in terms of greater family structures, in terms of less Black people ending up in prison. Okay. When you can see these outcomes in a time period where Black people were living in greater poverty, you have a vast majority of Black people, 87%, to a great minority, or at least a minority, 47% of Black people living in poverty. That's a big improvement from 87 to 47, 20 years, one generation. So
But
what
I'm
we're
not
arguing
denying that that's an
now, yeah,
improvement.
go ahead.
I agree that that's an improvement. Clearly, clearly, I would prefer if I had to choose between 87% of Black people living in under poverty and 47. I would choose 47 because that's harm reduction basically. Right now, we're looking at I forget the hold on. Right now, and well, as of 2019, it was 21. So about a
Well,
fifth of the Black
as of
population.
last year is 19.5.
Okay, cool. So
And
about
the
a
year
fifth
before
of
that was even lower.
okay, fine, but a fifth of the Black population is also an improvement from the 1960s, right?
Hmm.
Right. So no one's denying that we've improved over time. That's a good thing. I praise that. But the people who are still in poverty, that 20%, that one
Yeah.
fifth, right?
Hmm.
What we're basically debating is what are the causal mechanisms that gave rise to that. And your
Right.
argument, I don't think is a very convincing argument that a part of the causal mechanisms aren't the structural forms of racism that we're talking about. And also, just because, so I think one of the things that is tripping, I would say tripping you up is the racism part because you have to like not think about racism as just like racial animus or ill will. Like there's a white person there, they look at a black person, they call them the N word because they hate their guts because they have the wrong skin. Like
That's not what I
that's
think
kind
of
of
it. Yeah.
stereotypical. Okay, cool. But what people mean when they talk about structural racism, they're talking about a whole bunch of systemic and structural factors that give rise to disparate outcomes by race. And so the disparate outcomes by race in this case would be the fact that a far higher percentage of the black population is in poverty by comparison to their white counterparts, and also by comparison as using it as a benchmark to their percent of the population, right? It's only 9% for white people who are 60% of the population, but it's basically a fifth, 20% or so, just under 20% for a population that only comprises 13% of the entire population.
Yeah.
That's what they're pointing out. And what I'm saying is like that is what they mean when they're talking about systemic racism. They're not talking
Yeah.
about the racial animus thing. And
Except
I
I
don't
don't
think
think
you've
it's
said
systemic.
anything. I don't think you said anything to debunk that. Like you've actually
I
in
think
many ways
everything I'm saying is
acknowledged what they're
debunking that.
saying.
Yeah,
Okay,
like I
how?
said, pointing out the benchmark of percentage of population means nothing because again, like just because you end up as a minority or majority or overrepresented, underrepresented in any category is not proof of discrimination. Like disparate impact by race does not mean racism is the causal factor. Just like disparate impact by sex does not mean sexism is the causal factor. Doesn't mean that sexism cannot be the causal factor
Right.
of a
We
disparate
went over
impact,
that.
but
We went over all of
we
that.
have to prove right. So
Right.
so
But
what I'm
then the
saying,
question is, what are the causal mechanisms if not the systemic forms of oppression that I just cited?
oh, that's too easy. I mean, you have a community of people. Oh, by the way, this is something that I actually don't know, but I would be curious to find out what the actual numbers are. So we saw that white people's poverty rate is 7%, right? So it's 7%. You
Nine
got
as of
black people around.
2019.
So
Nine as of
nine,
2019 from the
nine
census.
and 20, right? So you got nine and let's say 20, right? So you got double the rate, roughly 10% white people, 20% black people in poverty, right? So I'd be curious to find out what was the poverty rate of white people, okay, in 1960, okay? And has that
Uh-huh.
number, yeah, so has the poverty rate of white people dropped as dramatically as the poverty rate of Black people. Okay, so has it dropped at a higher rate or a lower rate? Because if the argument is that, oh, well, we just see a disparate impact, or we just see a disparity, because white people have a lower percentage than Black people, that doesn't really tell us anything. If Black people have been rising out of poverty at a faster rate than white people throughout that time period, then it actually tells us that this country that is being labeled as being systemically racist has actually favored Black people at a greater extent than white people in terms of
because it
giving
dropped
them
at a
the
lower
opportunities to
rate.
rise above poverty.
What if the majority of them were already not in poverty? Then wouldn't you expect it to drop at a lower rate?
No, I'm talking about those who were under the poverty rate. So what
No, but you're
percentage of
talking about
white
the rate
people?
at which you're talking about the rate at which it dropped over a certain period of time, right?
hmm
You're
So
comparing the
let's
rate at
say,
which it dropped for white people versus the rate at which it dropped for Black people.
yeah, so let's say
That's what I
white
think.
people had a poverty rate of, I'm gonna just guess, let's say the poverty rate of white people was 50% in 1960. It's just a
Nope.
random guess. And
Overall,
let
the nation poverty fell from 22% overall in the nation in 1960, steeply down to 12. So that's overall 10%. It went from
right.
1960 to 1980. It went from 22% to 12%. And then it
hmm
moved up a little bit in 15 sorry. No,
Have
sorry.
you divided up by
Overall the
race?
nation of poverty rate hold on. No, I haven't yet. Overall the nation of the poverty rate fell from 22% in 1960 steeply down to 12% in 1980, then moved up moderately to 15% during the current era of rising inequality. Um okay. So whites in 1960 was oh, that's not helpful. Poverty, white and Black. White poverty rates fell from 17 to 9.4% in 1979, but then edged up to 10% in 2010. Okay.
So
At
from
the
you
same
said
time, black
19.
black poverty. Yeah. So it started at 17 and it went to 9.4 in 1979.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know like what year it started in 17, but it ended up by the time 1979 rolled around, it was 9.4%. But then it edged up to 10% in 2010. This is for whites. At the same time, Black poverty rates fell from a horrendous 55% in 1959 to under 30% in 1979. So for Blacks in 1979, it was 30%. For whites in 1979, it was 9.4%. Okay. Now, as I predicted, the rate at which it fell is going to be less for whites because the distance that it has to fall in the first place is already lower. So that's going to affect the rate if it goes in the same time span. There's a lot more room for improvement for Blacks, and they made a lot of improvement. To be fair, they went
hmm
25 percentage points of an improvement in 2 decades from
Dude, that says a
1959
lot.
to 1979. Um, and then from 17 to 9.4 is an improvement of about 7 or 8 percentage points. So what I think is unfair about the argument you just made is, to me, I don't think it's very useful to compare the rate at which the poverty level dropped, because you're comparing two different groups that had vastly different starting points. And the
No,
one
that's
that
what makes
started
it fair.
closer, no, that's what makes it not fair, because the group that had already low, like by comparison to every other group, and also by design, because of the way that the structure of the country was that favored them
Yeah, but think
heavily.
about how much that says. Like you come from obviously you start the starting point, you're way behind it, right? And you're still living in codified oppression. Yet your rise economically is at a
Yeah, but
greater rate than that
but
of
the
the
economic gains,
oppressors.
yeah, but the dramatic economic gain is largely due to the fact that the oppressors stopped oppressing them in specific ways. Like enslaving them, for example, or like not allowing them to have certain jobs, not allowing them to go to school. Like when you
hmm
quote unquote take all of those forms of explicit racial oppression away, then yeah, you would expect to have dramatic gains for that population,
Yeah,
right?
and
So
which
like
leads
it's
to
not
my
really saying
argument.
much.
It actually
But what
helps
I'm
my
saying is
argument.
no, it doesn't. It undermines your argument in a fundamental way because you're trying to sell this as evidence that it was better, that black people were in some sense better off by comparison to the way they are now, because there was a time when there was like more oppression, but the rate at which they dropped, the rate at which the the percentage of their population that was in poverty uh,
Yeah,
dramatically dropped, more dramatically than the white population that was by and large not in poverty in the first place because they benefited from all the forms of systemic oppression. That's the
yeah.
thing that undermines what you're arguing.
No, what I'm saying is they were better off culturally. That's what I'm saying.
Who
So
was the
black
black
people,
population?
yes, yes. During
Okay,
greater
but they
codified
weren't.
oppression, black people were better off culturally. Their
There are certain
outcomes
facets.
were
There's certain
testament to that.
facets of black culture that were improved. For example, black people tended to be married in the first place and then stay married. Um, it was a big deal for black people, particularly immediately after slavery, because black people typically weren't allowed to like stay with their families because their families were broken up during slavery and stuff like that. Also, they couldn't afford to get married in a lot of cases. Now black people did
Actually,
get married a
they
lot
got
during
married
slavery, but
during slavery.
like I literally just said that.
Yeah.
Black people did get married fairly frequently during slavery, but not always. And a lot of times, like their ability to like stay with their families was undermined or compromised by the fact that they were enslaved. That's what I was trying to say. But regardless, the only point I'm making is I acknowledge that the rate at which, especially after slavery ended, the rate at which the poverty level for black people dropped was more dramatic than that of white people. But my explanation, or I guess my rebuttal to that is that ain't really saying much, because white people by and large weren't really that impoverished in the first place, because they by and large benefited from the forms of oppression that created such a high percentage of black people in poverty in the first place. That's what I'm saying.
No, so you you go back 100 or 200 years ago, and virtually everyone is poor. Okay, and this is not just here in the United States. This is all Western world. Okay, virtually everyone lived on under $1 a day, the average person. Okay, so in America, even during slavery, the vast majority of white people weren't wealthy. The vast majority of them, that's why most of them never owned slaves, because it was expensive to own one in the first place. So you have the majority of white people who also were not living in plush luxury. Okay, sure, the societal conditions in which they lived were advantageous to that of black people who were considered slaves, for example. But the reason I said your argument actually lends to mine, or your evidence that you were pointing out actually lends to my argument, is the fact that this country has bent over backwards since its inception to make gains for black people. Like, it has been on a trajectory of a more perfect union since the start. You start off with slavery, then you get rid of it. You end up with Jim Crow, then you get rid of it. You end up with unequal representation under the law, to now equal representation under the law. And you have situations now where black people are being given an unfair advantage and as it pertains to being treated equally under the law. And
Dude,
that,
but that the passage of time that you're talking about is 400 years.
no, it's not 400 years.
Yeah, yes, it is. If you're gonna take slavery and Jim Crow into account, it's about 400 years, dude.
No,
Hmm.
do the math. When did
Okay.
slavery start?
In this country, in like the 1600s.
Okay, so well, America wasn't a country until 1776.
Okay,
But
but
even if I was to
you asked me
grant
when
you 16,
slavery in the country started.
yeah,
It
in the
started with
country,
it started
it
with
wasn't a
when the
country yet.
colonies.
But yeah, okay,
Okay.
I'll concede to your argument of 1600. 1619 is what they usually point to, right? When the first 20 slaves arrive in the United States, or in the country, as we call it.
Mhm.
1619 to 1865 is not 400 years.
Right, but that doesn't
Okay.
include Jim Crow. If
Okay,
you want
but
to
you're not
include
in
Jim Crow, then
slavery.
you're talking about
Yeah,
1965. No, but you wait, hold on.
that's not
You
400 years
said
even.
that Jim Crow, dude, what? So from 1619 to, let's say,
1619 to
1960,
1865
no,
is
to
246 years.
1967
Okay.
is
So then you got
300 and
300.
Right.
350 years, give or take.
All right, cool. So then at best you could say I'm 1500 I'm 50 years over.
Yeah, except for the
350
fact that,
years. Go
and
ahead.
that's me being generous because I gave you 1619
Ooh,
as the starting
thank you
point.
for that.
Yeah,
But
because
like
it wasn't a, if you're going to
350
indict the
years.
country, if you, and by the way, the first one of the first slave owners was black, Anthony
The
Johnson
fuck
in
does
the
that have
United
to do
States.
with the point I'm making? That has nothing to do with what I'm saying.
The
What I'm
point
saying,
I'm making is that
first of all,
people blame
I
America.
acknowledge that you had non-white slave owners. That's a fact. No one
Yeah,
denies that. Very fucking rare, but nobody denies that. What I'm saying is
it was
it's
also rare
not
for white
really
people
a
to have slaves.
flex to say that America was on a trajectory towards forming a more perfect union when that trajectory spanned 350 years of since the suppression of black people, bro. And for you to just gloss over that like that wasn't a ridiculous amount of time for people to have a
Well,
boot on their neck, and then act like that has nothing to do with the disparities that we see in so many domains in our country, not included but not limited to income inequality, disparities in education, disparities in access to healthcare, etc., is real disingenuous. And that's the kind of thing that frustrates me when we have this debate, because every time I try to point this out to you, you try to make it seem like 2022 is in some sense unrelated to that 350 year span of history whereby
mhm.
black people were explicitly and objectively kept from developing the wealth and all of the systemic forces that go into maintaining wealth over subsequent generations, right? Like that has nothing to do with the conditions of poverty that motherfuckers in the south side of Chicago live in,
Yeah,
or places like Baltimore, or places like Philly, or
yeah,
places like LA, like Compton, right? Like that has nothing to do with their conditions. Like, come on, man.
yeah.
Like
Because
I at a certain point, I really need you to use your common sense. Like,
yeah,
how is it possible that the people who live in poverty now in 2022, that there's no causal relationship whatsoever to that history of oppression for black people?
yeah. It's simple. It's you would have to draw a straight line from slavery to some guy in South Chicago going to kill somebody or being in the level of poverty that they are right now. What we know of right now is that the conditions of poverty, well, number one, for black people in this country are very low. We just you just looked up the stats. I was right. 19.5% of
It's
black
a
people are in
fifth.
poverty.
It's a fifth of the
Okay,
population. That's not
yes.
low. That's
No, no, no.
way too high.
But it is dramatically lower than what it was even in 1960 at 47%. Okay? Like
Okay,
if you look
I
at the
agree that
trajectory of black people getting out
it's
of poverty, it's on a steady decline, okay? Over time,
I have no problem admitting that it's on a decline and that it's dramatically lower than
right?
it was in 1960. That's not my issue. My issue is that you're trying to frame that evidence somehow that there's no link causally between the poverty that black people experienced in 2022 and the poverty that has been experienced by black people throughout the country's history.
Okay, so
That
let me
that's
ask
what
you
I'm
this,
fighting.
right? So let me ask you this question. What other causal factors can you think of that would be the reasons as to why black people in America would find themselves poor?
So one of the biggest ones is that black people have been summarily deprived for extended ridiculous spans of time from creating wealth that they can then pass down to subsequent generations, right? So the percentage of black people who have the ability to pass down like their the product of wealth that they've generated over hundreds of years to their progeny, right, has been systemically prevented for the majority of the existence of the country, whereby white people, right, it has been not only preserved but maximized in the same span of time. And so one of the causal explanations for why white people's um, wealth is ridiculously higher than every other racial group in this country, right, by and large, like that's part of an explanation, a causal explanation for that. Because one of the biggest contributing factors to wealth is you getting it from prior generations. So that's just one example. What do you say to
Actually, it
that?
is not. By the data, and I can
Actually, what
pull
is
this
not?
up, right?
Actually,
So,
what is not?
wealth generation is not
Uh,
by and large a factor of you being able to get wealth from your preceding generations. It is not by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay,
As
then
it pertains
what is the biggest
to
contributor
wealth,
to wealth in the country?
human capital. That's the
I don't know,
largest
like
contributor.
labor? You mean labor?
No, human capital,
What does that mean?
skills, knowledge, experience. Okay, so the skills that you learn, your increase in education, your increase in the different skills that are needed in the country to warrant higher incomes, those are human capital. Ththose are the things
Okay,
that catapult
I'm
people
gonna
from poverty. And
I'm gonna
when you
contradict
look
you right
at,
now.
sure, but let me just say this as far as generational wealth is concerned. The vast majority of people never receive generational wealth to start off. Okay? Even white people. And as a matter of fact, you're just as likely to not receive generational wealth from a millionaire household as you are from somebody who's just getting by. That's how rare it is. Second, for those people who do receive generational wealth, and by the way, the stat is um, the 70 to 80% of all the people who are millionaires, okay, who would be considered wealthy in this country, are self-made. Okay. So the vast majority, 70 to 80%. So that means
Wait,
that these people didn't get
wait,
like
wait,
money
wait,
handed
wait,
down to them.
wait, 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 what? So
It's
being
true.
self-made does not mean that you didn't inherit money. I just want you to know that.
What does being self-made mean?
So being self-made is completely consistent with you having inherited money. What? You can also also you could have just been given a loan, so to speak, like what Donald Trump was given. This motherfucker was given like what $4 million loan, which then he turned into whatever his industry was that he capitalized on,
Okay.
and he's described as self-made, but he was given a large sum of capital by his family, if only for a limited amount of time because he borrowed it. Then I presumably he paid it back, right? Like the ability of one person to even receive that is predicated upon somebody from the prior generation having that capital to give them in the first place, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't
It's
consider
still another
Donald
example of
Trump
the
to be
same thing.
self-made because he's not. That's not the definition I'm
Okay,
running off of.
he
What I'm
considers
saying,
himself self-made.
well, he
Go
can
ahead.
consider himself whatever he wants. That doesn't make it so. What I'm saying is the 70 to 80% of everyone who has generational wealth, which is what you're talking about, are self-made,
Mhm.
meaning that they didn't receive wealth passed down from the previous generation.
70% of people who are wealthy are self-made. Is that
Yes,
repeat your stat
that's
again?
yes.
70% of people who are currently wealthy are self-made, meaning they did not receive any capital or property from their inheritances. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, can
So
you
this
prove
is
that? Because I don't believe that at all. I need you to fact.
so there's
I'm
Business
calling you to
News
fact check that.
Daily. Sure.
Okay,
So
show
according
show it
to
show
Business,
it. Well, hold
all
on.
right,
I want
cool.
you to show
Let
it
me
to my audience,
let me
and then
go
while you do
ahead and
that, I'm gonna read this, and then
yeah.
I'm gonna have you give your rebuttal. So this contradicts something that you said that I found. This is something I found quick. I can find a better source if you have an issue with the source, if you don't think it's trustworthy or something. It's Deloitte. I don't even know how to say it. Deloitte. I don't even know how to say this. Deloitte Insight says, the more you have, the more you gain. How home ownership and stocks contribute to the wealth gap in America. So homes and stocks make up a large proportion of U.S. household wealth, and that's the predicate. That's the thing that my argument is predicated on. Great news for those of you who have them, but many minority households and younger households don't. Okay. So, one of the biggest keys or one of the greatest indicators of wealth in this country is that you hold properties or
Hmm.
homes, you own homes, or that you hold stocks. Okay. Those are one of the two contributing factors. Okay. And homes and property are typically passed down when people die. And a lot of the land ownership in early America, right, was almost exclusively owned by white people, particularly prior to slavery ending. Right, it was very rare for a black person to own land during slave days. I think it did happen, but it was extremely rare. Right, and those are one of the biggest wealth creators for the descendants of those people who own the land. Right, and that contributes to a lot of the trends I think we see by race today in 2022. That's one of the straight lines that I would draw, that, to put it in your words, from slave times to the race, the wealth gap, the wealth inequalities that we see by race in 2022. Um, I'm gonna read this and then you can have your rebuttal. U.S. wealth inequality is becoming more entrenched after the COVID-19 recession, as the divide between asset haves and have-nots become greater, with home and stock ownership being the largest contributors to the growing gap. Before February 2020 and April 2022, median home prices rose by 45% and stock portfolio values grew by 40%, boosting the wealth of those who own homes and stock holdings, but leaving those who did not further behind. Government support programs were important contributors in reducing income and wealth inequality in the aftermath of the pandemic. The share of the wealth accruing to the bottom 50% of households reached its highest level in 2003. All right. So they're talking about like the more recent manifestations of this. But this to me is just a continuation of a lot of the systemic trends that we've already been seeing in terms of who ends up generating and by this argument keeping and maintaining their wealth over time. And I'm including generations of people, so them passing it down to further to their lineage, and then who doesn't. If you don't own a home or own any land or have any stocks, right, then you can't pass it down to your children. And I'm thinking, and so that those trends from all the way in the fucking 1600s all the way to 2022, I think have been a major contributing factor to why a lot of Black people, even though way more do now than ever before, but a lot of Black people still don't own homes, they still don't own stocks, etc. So I want to hear your rebuttal, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, even when it comes to like stocks or whatever assets that people might have acquired through any period of time, the stat still remains. Not only is it a vast minority of people who are able to pass down wealth transfer, but more importantly is what happens after it's passed down, because the vast majority of people don't have the skills to keep wealth. So you end up with 70% of all wealth dissipating in 2 generations and 90% of it dissipating in 3 generations. Okay, going back to the source that I was alluding to earlier, as far as being self-made, and people who are considered wealthy being people who like make over $1 million. You have a 2019 study, and let me share this. Let's see here. How do I? Okay, so I think it's this one. Yep. So 2019 study published by
Uh,
WealthTax found that
like,
around. Can you see this?
yeah, I see it.
All right. Yeah. So this is Business Daily. Um, Found that 68% of those with a net worth of 30 million or more
Sorry,
made
let
it
me do me a
themselves.
favor. Do me a favor
Yeah.
and increase the size of your screen so that like my viewers can read it better.
All right.
Perfect.
Is this
Thank you.
better?
Yep, that's
Yeah.
perfect.
And then it says further, a second study by Fidelity Investments found that 88% of all millionaires are self-made, meaning they did not inherit their wealth. Okay.
Yeah, but
Um,
wait, sorry, but millionaires does not mean so there are a lot of people who are wealthy who are not millionaires necessarily, right?
yeah, but that was and what do you call it? I gave my definition of what I consider people to be wealthy, people making $1 million or more. Okay, so
Well, that's
millionaires, and that's
arbitrary.
what.
Well, but
Well,
well,
I
wait,
said
wait, hold
that.
on. What we're
Yeah.
talking about, though, to be fair, let's be fair. What we're talking about
Uh-huh.
is people who are above the poverty line, and that's going to include people who are not millionaires,
Oh,
right?
okay. So, what is the likelihood of somebody who isn't a millionaire and who is making $50,000 a year to
Uh-huh.
pass down their wealth? And what is the likelihood of somebody who is making $1 million a year to pass down their wealth?
A person who's making more in general, including the people who make a million or more, are going to be able to. They're going to be in a better position to pass down wealth for sure because they have more of it, right?
So they're in a better position to do it, but that doesn't mean that they
Yeah.
do. And that's what's so interesting about this whole like generational wealth thing. Because what you find is that even when it comes to wealthy families, like millionaire households, the
Uh-huh.
likelihood of them passing down wealth to their kids is just as likely as someone who is coming from a middle class or high middle class family, just getting by. It
I don't
is
know. I
crazy.
Well, okay. I'm about to disagree, but to steel man you, I think what you really mean is anybody who has the capacity at whatever their income level to accumulate assets and then subsequently pass those down, right, is just as likely as somebody who's even more able because they make more money in the same span of time to do so. I think that's what you mean, and I think that intuitively seems right. But like there's levels to this shit. So there's a difference between somebody who's making 60K a year, who's accumulating assets at that income level, passing their
Sure.
assets down to their kids, and somebody who's making $1 million plus a year doing the same thing, because they're going to be able to accumulate more assets in the same amount of time, and then therefore make more in returns on their and whatever investments that they have on their assets, or if it's property, the equity or the improved value of it, the increase in value, and that's going to be a return on
We're
their
making
investment,
assumptions
is going to
though,
be.
just to
Well,
be a little
yeah, but I mean,
cautionary. We're
I
making
think these
assumptions that they're able to acquire more assets, or that they're going to acquire more assets, or
No,
that
but in
they
general, if you
want.
have more capital, you are able to acquire more assets. It doesn't mean
Not
you necessarily
necessarily.
will every time. No, hold on. You have the potential to, right? The opportunity to. There's more opportunity. It doesn't mean that you actually will, because there's all kinds of
Sure,
things that can negatively impact that, right? I'm
sure.
not guaranteeing that they're going to do it. What I'm saying is, on the whole, the more capital you have, right, you are better able to accumulate more assets because you have more capital that you use as an instrument to go get the assets. That's
Right.
like
So I don't
right?
agree.
Okay,
I don't disagree with you there, right? So if you have more money, you have more capacity to buy more stuff, right?
right,
To buy more
right.
assets. The
Mhm.
problem is, and this is what these rich people find out, and that's why there's better vehicles to do this today, and they had to be invented for this particular reason, is because human capital trumps all. When you have kids that don't have the skill set that you had to maintain the wealth, let alone increase it, you're fearful of what could happen if you just transfer all this wealth to your kids, because it could destroy them. We've seen this time and time again. That's
If it's not
why,
managed, yeah, if it's managed poorly, yes, I agree with you. So there's a
yeah,
risk
and that's
of
what happens to
transferring.
majority of wealth. It's managed
No, that's
poorly.
not what happens to the majority of. So there's a lot of instances of what you're saying that is definitely true, but I don't think that's what happens to the majority of wealth. Particularly, the more wealthy you are, right?
No,
Let's
majority of wealth is dissipated.
the What do you mean?
Majority of wealth dissipates in 3 generations, tops.
Oh,
Like this is,
okay,
yeah, so
but
like regardless of how rich you are,
mhm,
the stat is 90% of all wealth, generational wealth, generate like wealth transferred through generations is will be
uh-huh.
gone by the third, which goes to show us that like there's a big determining
I'm a
factor of human
I'm a
capital.
fact check you on that. I need you to prove that.
Yes, so
What you're
here's
saying
the
is not
source
intuitive to
right
me.
here. Let me just share my screen so I don't have to keep.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
All right, here you go.
So do you see this now?
Yep.
All right. So
Why do
generational
70% of
wealth.
families lose their wealth in the second generation? So that's
Yeah. And
70% of families, not 70% of wealthy families. That's including people. Come on, dude. We're not
yeah,
just
but
talking
this
about
this is,
millionaires here, dude.
yeah, what does this say? Generational wealth, right?
Generational wealth, yeah.
Yeah.
But
So this
70%
is,
of families lose their
yes.
wealth.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
You want to get deeper. It is estimated
Yeah.
that 70% of wealthy families will
Uh-huh.
lose their wealth by the
Uh-huh.
second generation, and 90% will lose it by the third.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Generations are taught not to talk about money. Okay? And the prior generations worry that the next generation will become lazy and entitled. Many do
Okay.
not have any
I
clue
concede.
about the value of money, how to handle it. Right?
Okay, I
So,
concede.
like,
I can see the point you're making, but what I don't see is how it proves what you're saying.
so the proof of this is that if we know for a fact that the vast majority of wealth dissipates, okay, regardless of whether you're rich or not, if you transfer money from as a 50K per year earner or a 50
Mhm,
million per year earner, that it
mhm,
will dissipate within 3 generations, and 70% of it will dissipate within just 2 generations, then it is
mhm,
clear as day to draw the conclusion that number one, human capital is a major factor as to what determines the ability of one generation versus the next to maintain their wealth. That's first of all. Second, it also proves that the straight line that you're trying to draw from like slavery to now as being the causal factor for people's economic realities simply isn't true. People aren't reaping the effects of generational wealth by and large from slavery, because even if all white people had wealth during slavery, it would not be true today for the simple fact that, again,
Not wait. First of
90% of
all,
all
wait,
the
wait,
wealth
wait,
would have been
wait.
dissipated
Not all white
generations ago.
people. Not all white people. Not all white people had wealth during slavery. That there were poor
No, I
white
didn't say
people
that.
even
I'm
during
saying if
slavery.
they did. If they did. I'm steel
Okay,
manning.
but
I'm
the
saying
ones that did,
even if white
but the
people did.
ones. Okay, but what I'm trying to get you to understand is that there are certain things that are like primary contributors or like predictors of wealth in the country, right? This source that I have points to two of those assets: home equity and retirement accounts, particularly in 2019, accounted for 65.2% of households. But owning homes or properties and or land historically have been the biggest predictors of wealth generationally.
Okay.
And that's
Okay.
that is intimately correlated with or even connected to slavery, because you had for an extended period of time explicit prohibitions against certain groups of people, i.e., slaves and their descendants, from even owning property or having
hmm
access to the materials that they would need to even acquire those assets, right?
And I don't
And in
disagree
fact,
with you there.
the slaves themselves were considered an asset of sorts
Yeah,
for the wealthy,
I don't disagree
right?
with
So
you there. What we're
okay,
disagreeing
cool.
about is
But wait.
2022.
Wait. No, but no, no.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, when it comes to transferring wealth over that extended period of time, there's going to be a complicated story to tell, right? Because the primary assets by which wealth was stored have changed and ebbed and flowed over time. But one of the ones that have remained consistent was owning land and property since slave
hmm
days, right? Okay, so like those are the kinds of things that got passed down consistently throughout that time. And I can
Yeah.
draw a line through that particular kind of asset to now, right?
Yeah,
And
but those are part of
what
the
I'm
wealth
trying to
that's
tell you,
dissipated.
okay, that's fine. But what I'm saying is, by and large, the ones that maintain were mostly white people because they had it in the first place. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, except for the fact that, again,
So if it's
regardless
90%,
of
then that 10%, hold on. If it's 90% that dissipated, right, by the third generation or whatever, right? And that trend held all the way to 2022, then you would still have 10%. It stands to reason, right? Or something thereabouts that maintained it. And I'm saying the vast majority of them will be white if you start from a point where black people couldn't own any of the assets that would have generated the wealth, right?
Yeah, so
And
that's actually an
that's
argument from silence. It's not so saying
how,
90% of wealth dissipates in the third generation does not mean that 10% of wealthy families kept their wealth forever. That is not what that says. It just says that 90% of
dude. I'm not,
their wealth
dude.
dissipates in three generations. The other 10% could have their wealth dissipate in four or five or six generations. We don't know. Now, we
Okay,
could look
okay,
that up,
fine.
but
Okay,
you
fine.
can't say that it just lasted forever because
Okay,
we don't have
fine.
the
That's
other
fine. That's
10%.
a fair. That's actually a fair counterpoint. But what all I'm trying to say is, like, dude, the main, no matter what time period you're talking about throughout this
hmm
history, right? The things that the assets in which wealth generally was primarily stored, right? if if you have a certain group of people that was deprived from accumulating all of those assets, then it stands to reason that the whatever wealth made it through to 2022 is going to be concentrated in the hands of white people, right?
Wrong.
That's the point I'm making. Okay, so then explain how that's not true.
So it's not true for the simple reality that even when it comes to like houses, right? And
Mhm,
the ability to purchase houses.
mhm.
During Jim Crow and during redlining, black people acquired homes at a faster rate than than white people.
But
Okay? Um,
only a small percentage of them were able to acquire homes in the first
actually,
place.
actually, majority of black people who applied for home mortgages were approved, just like it is today.
But that, no, no, I'm talking about, wow. The majority of black people who applied, right? Whatever
Yeah.
percentage that is, I guarantee you, is not going to be the majority of black people writ large in the country at that time.
Yeah, because majority of white people also don't apply for mortgages. The majority of everybody
Okay.
doesn't apply for
So my
mortgages. I'm saying
then the claim that
because
I
that
made, wait, hold on. Wait, but then logically, then the claim that I made must be true, which is that it's not the majority of black people who own homes.
I didn't say that. I said that is not a meaningful metric to say majority of black people don't own homes. It's just as meaningless as saying majority of white people don't own homes. The meaningful metric is to
No,
look
it's
at,
not meaningless.
okay,
Wait, it's not
where's the
meaningless
discrimination
because the
happening?
percentage of black people who don't own homes is higher than the percentage of white people who don't own homes, and that actually is a reflection of the income inequality or the wealth inequality that we're talking about.
Okay, so I can concede that there is a disparity of income between white people and black people. The argument, though, here, if you're going to talk about discrimination as it pertains to like owning houses or getting a mortgage loan, you can't argue about everyone, all black people, and whether or not they have a home. You have to argue about those who apply to get a home, because it makes no sense to argue about whether or not you can get a home if you've never applied. We only deal with those
Yeah,
who
but
applied to get a home mortgage loan and got denied.
dude,
That's a way
dude,
more meaningful thing
why
to
would
argue
you
about.
apply if you don't have the capital and if you don't have the credit?
Yeah, why would
It
white people apply if they don't have the capital and they don't have the credit? It's the
But
same
the
thing for
white
everyone.
people have statistically, dude, we just went over the data. The white people are statistically more likely to have those things than black people. That's the point I'm making. That's one of the
Okay.
that's part of the
Except for the fact,
conditions systemically
except for the
that contribute
fact,
to these trends. Bro. That's what
yeah,
I'm talking
except for the fact that
these
during
inequalities.
redlining, which is what everybody jumps to, black people had their home ownership rate grew at a faster rate than that of white people.
That doesn't mean anything.
It
That
means a
doesn't mean
lot.
anything. No, it
It
doesn't.
means
The rate
everything.
at which it grew doesn't is not an it's not the best metric
Are you
for
serious? So
determining
you're telling me
relative.
that at a time
No,
where,
wait. That's not a good basis of comparison for what the wealth they actually have. The rate at which it grew does not tell you the rate. It does not give you. It's not the best indicator of the inequality in the first place. It actually is in a weird way obfuscating the inequality because you keep touting the fact that it grew at a faster rate. And if you take into account the fact that black people saw off at a worse point and then had all of those valves of oppression taken off of them, and then they rapidly grew in the wake of that, then like yeah, I would expect
so
that to happen
so
because they're no longer being oppressed in that way.
oh, so they're not being oppressed in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So redlining, for example,
absolutely.
is a form of systemic oppression that negatively impacted black people, and black people were the targets of that.
No, so that's exactly the counterpoint that I'm trying to make is that during redlining, when people argue that black people are being systemically oppressed from getting homes, that black people are actually getting homes at a higher rate than that than white people did. Like the home ownership rates
That
are a
doesn't
big deal
but
because if you're
way
coming from a
more white
place,
people as a percentage got homes, dude. And I actually got the like homes in affluent areas that black people were redlined out of.
yeah, and
That has implications for wealth creation. That has implications for wealth
there
creation.
is a strong reason as to why black people would be denied mortgages. I'm not arguing against that. I mean, you're coming from a place of Jim
But
Crow,
no, but
straight from
dude,
slavery, and then we're expecting black people to somehow start off on the same playing field economically and being approved at the same rates.
no,
It's not going to happen.
no,
You're going to
no, no,
have
no, no. My
disparities.
point is not that they're gonna magically start off at the same point. My point is that the reason why black people were disadvantaged in the first place is a continuation of the history by which they were disadvantaged in all sorts of ways, right? And so that's the straight line that you keep trying to block for some reason with these
Except
random
it's not a
tidbits.
straight line. Like if they would continue to not
It is
own homes,
complex. It is complex, but it is a straight line because that's
well, they
how
would.
that continued. That's how those forms of those systemic forms of oppression continued to negatively impact all of the prospects for black people to create and maintain wealth. That's
So, but
and
your
so
same
the
argument.
trends of wealth inequalities that we see maintained today, that's the vehicle by which they were preserved. Even though black people have made gains since the 60s, right? And I guess the 40s, right? Like the fact that we still have a fifth of the black population that's living under the poverty line is a function of those trends that continued. That's the mechanism by which that trend is preserved. That's one of the explanatory factors that people give why black people are 20% in the like 20% of the black population under the poverty line, while only 9% of the white population is under the poverty line. And you keep trying to make it seem like they have nothing to do with each other. Like I don't see how you can maintain that. That seems like such an untenable position given all of the evidence.
No, I think it's simple, right? You end up with a country that starts off with a certain group of people who are disadvantaged and a certain group of people who aren't as disadvantaged. And one group of people starts off, you know, ahead of the starting point and the other one starts behind the starting point. And then now we're arguing about disparate impact, especially during a time when there is clear discrimination by race. I'm arguing that even during that time, when there was clear discrimination by race, you still had black people making gains at a faster rate than white people. And if the system was built, right, to never advantage black people and to always keep them down, then there would be no meaningful metric to look at and be like, well, here white people are actually losing against black people. Well, here white people's growth is actually growing at a lesser rate than that of black people. But what we find is that time and time again throughout American history, you have black people making massive gains. You have black people who end up with, as majority poor to minority poor, from not being able to own houses to being able to own houses, from being like forget not getting loans. You couldn't even own property, and then now you can not only own property, but you can you're acquiring property at a faster rate than a whole subset of people who were considered as the oppressors at some point. The meaningful metric to me is this, as it comes to systemic racism in America in 2022, is if you're going to make the claim that systemic racism is real and alive today, that's keeping black people down, you have to demonstrate by accounting for all the other confounding variables as to why systemic racism, okay, is the causal factor for black people. If you're going to say it's housing, if you're going to say it's income, whatever, you have to say that, hey, these other reasons are not it. Systemic racism has to be it. I don't think you can demonstrate
That doesn't make
one
any sense. That's a
area
terrible
in which
argument.
you can I don't think you
That's
I
a
don't think you can
terrible
show me any
argument.
example where black people are in the positions that they are today strictly because of systemic racism and no other confounding variable. I don't think you can do that.
Wait, systemic racism entails a bunch of variables. That's what we're fundamentally talking about are a bunch of different variables that coalesce, and that systemic racism is the umbrella term used for those things. So I've been
I'm talking about
describing some
other
of those things.
variables that are not linked to racism at all. I'm talking about other variables that aren't linked to
Dude,
racism that you've
this
accounted for,
dude,
and now you're left with
what
this racism.
hold on. So now I got it. Now I got it. Okay, so I see that I'm gonna have to go to definitions in a second. I guess I'll go to the definitions and then I'll come back to the one I thought I found earlier.
It's all good.
But Leia, let me go to these definitions real quick. Let's see. Where is uh okay, so health affairs. There we go. All right. Hopefully that this can help us out here. All right. So this is from Health Affairs, Systemic and Structural Racism, Definitions, Examples, Health Damages, and Approaches to Dismantling. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm being as clear as possible about what it is that people have in mind when they talk about systemic racism. You keep talking about it as if the racism part is something that is something that is separable from the structural part. And what people are talking about is all of the structural things that give rise to discrepancies by race.
For
That's
sure.
what they mean when they say systemic racism. So racism, according to this abstract, is not always conscious, explicit, or readily visible. Often it is systemic and structural. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, and entrenched practices and beliefs that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color, with adverse health consequences. Examples include residential segregation, unfair lending practices, and other barriers to home ownership and accumulating wealth, schools' dependence on local property taxes, environmental injustice, biased policing and sentencing of men and boys of color, and voter suppression policies. This article defines systemic and structural racism using examples, explains how they damage health through many causal pathways, and suggests approaches to dismantling them. Because systemic and structural racism permeate all sectors and areas, addressing them will require mutually reinforcing actions in multiple sectors and places. Acknowledging their existence is a crucial first step. All right. So the kind of thing that we're talking about here are things that are embedded into our systems, our laws, our policies that give rise to disparate outcomes by race. That's fundamentally what we're talking about. That's the sense in which it's systemic and racist. It's the racial discrepancy in outcomes is the racist part, and the systemic and structural part is the fact that it's embedded, usually in a very passive way, into our systems, structures, laws, protocols, procedures, all of that kind of stuff,
So can you
in
give
terms of
me an
how our
example?
society runs.
Can you give me an example of
So,
a codified law
several.
that is available today that is creating disparate impact by race that is
So examples include
available?
residential segregation, unfair lending practices, and other barriers to home ownership and accumulating wealth, schools' dependence on local property taxes, environmental injustice, biased policing and sentencing of men and boys of color,
That
voter
doesn't tell me
suppression
anything.
policies. Those are all examples that apply today. I'm literally
I
rereading the
don't think
parts
they
that I
apply.
that
I think those are. I think
you
those
don't think
are.
that there are.
I think they're bad
But
examples, and I don't think they're actually real examples. Like, for example, pointing to uh, policing, or pointing to housing discrimination, or pointing to what was the other thing you read? Um,
why are those bad examples?
they're bad examples because these aren't products of racism. Okay, I can point to other confounding variables that would be the reasons as to
They are
why.
systemic things that give rise to disparate outcomes by race.
No,
So
they're
in
not.
that sense, they are examples of systemic racism
They're not
by
systemic
definition.
racist. Okay, so for example, black people as an aggregate, okay, tend to speed more than other races.
Okay.
Okay, that's just a
That
fact.
doesn't explain
Uh,
discrepancies in sentencing for certain
I'm not
crimes.
talking about sentencing right now. I'm just talking
But
about
this
like
is
disparate.
but
Okay,
this is
so it said police. What was the?
biased policing and
Yeah,
sentencing of
bias
men and
policing.
boys of color.
Yeah, so
And
bias
no, hold on.
and
You got to
sentencing.
read the whole
Yeah.
thing.
Okay, sure. Let's
By
do
of
that.
men.
Yeah. So bias policing and sentencing of men and boys of color. Okay, so I'll
Yeah.
deal with that. So black people speed more than white people. Okay, that's a
Mhm,
fact. That's been proven by data.
mhm.
You have black
You
people.
haven't shown any data,
Oh,
by
I
the way,
mean,
but go ahead.
uh, I
I'll
could.
take
I've
your
been
word for it.
right on
Go
every
ahead.
single thing I've
Not
shared.
really,
On
bro.
on
Not really.
everything you've asked me to show you data on, you've conceded. You've been like, okay, all right, cool, right? But I can do that as
um,
well. I can go and find you the article that shows that black people speed on an average more than white people or other races. Okay, I can show that.
mhm.
It's not a big deal, but it's what I'm trying to drive at is that you have groups of people who have never been equal ever and will never be equal. So you have black people who have different
Isn't that the problem?
no. That's just like if humanity was perfect and we had zero capacity for discrimination, okay, you would still have
Mhm.
gross disparities by race. That is something a lot of people never take time to contend with. If human beings
You
had
could have gross disparities by race, but not
you
necessarily as a result of the same causal mechanisms that I'm trying to articulate right now, which we're
Sure,
talking about
that's
forms of
precisely the
oppression.
point, is what I'm trying to drive at, Jason, is that the fact that we can do a thought experiment and think of a world where discrimination does not exist. Like, just picture that for a second. Human beings not being able to discriminate, okay, by any metric, by race, racial discrimination. Like, let's let's act like that was a non-factor. You would still have people with gross disparities, and if you broke it down by race, you would find it there as well. So we know that there's massive disparities by geography. We know there's massive disparities by birth order. We know there's massive disparities by family structure. We know that there's so many causal factors as to why people end up in disparate situations, right? So the fact that you have black
Yeah,
people who
but they I don't think that they would fall. So I kind of I think I get what you're trying to say, but I actually don't agree with the way you're trying to apply it.
so like
Because
this example that you
I think that there are a whole bunch of things that contribute to disparities other than like racial animus, for example, which is what I think you're trying to say, and that makes sense to me. But like
yes,
the disparate outcomes by race that we're seeing are the product of very specific historical occurrences, though. So this move to a hypothetical world in which we could imagine conceivably gross discrepancies by race that were in fact not the result of the same kinds of patterns of explicit racial discrimination that we see in our actual history doesn't really help our discussion, because the whole thing I've been trying to argue is that these trends that we see today are actually causally the product of a lot of those actual occurrences in history. That's what
But
I've
what
been
I'm
trying
trying
to
to
argue.
tell you is that, the reason why this debate is actually pretty fruitful is that the fact that you have so many confounding variables that are outside of race that cause these massive disparities to begin with. That's why I was asking you to think of a world with zero discrimination. Not to say that there could ever be a world with zero racial discrimination. All I'm saying is that even if that world existed, you'd still have massive disparities. People are different for a whole legion of reasons. We make different decisions. We have
Okay, that's
different
fine.
aspirations,
That's fine.
right? So
I
even when
already
it comes to bias policing and sentencing, I mean, black people are disproportionately represented in every category of violent crime in the country by the FBI. Every single one of them. Okay? Like you look at the UCR crime report, and black people are overrepresented. Table 43A, if you're looking it up. They're overrepresented juxtaposed to their percentage of population, which is what you were using earlier. They're overrepresented in
right.
every single category. And if you're
Okay.
overrepresented in every single category, and the most
Uh-huh.
gross category being murder, seeing that black people are only 13% of the population, yet black offenders are 53% of all murders in the country, that is,
Uh-huh.
you can reasonably expect that those people, okay, black people, will be policed more than other people who are not as exacerbated in violent crime, which means that you will have more policing in those areas, which means that even if black people, let's say, um, smoked weed or used cocaine at the same rate or even a lower rate than white people, they would still end up getting stopped and sentenced more than their white counterparts. Why? Because you're being policed more, which means you'll get stopped more frequently, which means you will get in.
But that's not a good thing, and that proves the point that is being made here, which is that is a clear bias in policing
But it's not
policy.
a bias. Like
But it is a
it's not
bias,
a bias.
though.
It's not a bias in the fact
Wait,
that
hold
it's
on. Wait,
warranted.
wait, 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 wait. No, it's not warranted. Once you admit that black people are not using weed at higher rates than their white counterparts, and actually, I've read studies that say that white people use it more, but that black people are overrepresented in our prison population because they're policed more, then you don't get to say it's not bias. That's
No, no,
textbook
no, no, no.
bias.
But you're missing. I hate this word,
And
nuance. You're
wait,
missing the nuance of
no,
it all.
I'm not missing any
Yeah,
nuance.
you do.
There's
You
no
are.
justification for over policing a population that you already admit does not
Oh,
use weed
there's
or violate the law at a
there's
higher
so
rate,
much
bro. What?
justification for over policing
No, there
people.
is not.
Why would
Why
you?
is there
Okay, why do you
justification
think?
for over policing people? No, hold on. Why is there justification for over policing black people specifically when it comes to weed violations?
No, okay. So you're
What is
you're
the
you're
justification for that?
you're framing it wrongly. I'm not saying that they're over policed for weed. I'm saying that they're over policed, period, for violent crime. And the fact that you will get stopped more, which means you'll get caught more frequently, even though you're being stopped for some other infraction, like a traffic light, like because black people speed more. Guess what? You'll get stopped
But
more
that's
frequently, which means if you even
dude,
smoking weed at a lesser rate than white people, the instances of you being found with weed will be at a greater proportion than your white counterparts. That's
I
just
understand
a
what you're saying.
simple
You're
math.
trying to say that there's a justification for policing black people more because black people are overrepresented
Yes.
in the
Violent
categories for
crime.
certain crimes, including
Yeah.
but not limited to violent crimes.
Yes.
And so, as a perhaps unintended consequence of this justification, you could get discrepancies in punishments for even non-violent offenses like weed possession, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I've demonstrated that I understood your
Unintended
point. But what
consequences.
I'm
Yeah.
saying is, that unintended consequences is precisely the example of bias policing that we're talking about, because there is no justification for over policing black people with respect to that crime,
So
because
so
black people actually don't even use weed more than white people.
here's
That's
the
what I'm
reason
saying.
why it's not biased is the fact that if white people were overrepresented in violent crime, they would also be overly policed. That is a fact. Police
How is that a
respond.
fact if it's a
It's it,
hypothetical?
it no, no, no. It's a fact because we know that the reason why black people are over police is because police respond to calls for help. When somebody gets
First of all,
murdered,
we don't know that. That's an argument. That's a contention.
okay,
Given the history of
so
policing, there's actually some reasonable doubt about that
so
because a lot of times, hold on, because
let me get
just
my
like you
charger
just
real quick.
demonstrated with
I don't want
respect
this
to
to
the
die.
weed. All
Give
right.
me like 2 seconds. I'm gonna run upstairs and grab my charger.
All right. Well, for the audience, then, but let me arrive at this point, and then I'll repeat it when you come back. Is like the point I'm trying to make is just like what was demonstrated by the bias policing with respect to non-violent offenses like weed violation, or even like the stop and frisk policies, which disproportionately like targeted Black people or negatively impacted Black people. Right. What these do is they reify certain tropes and negative stereotypes of Black people in our country, that they have a special kind of connection towards criminality, and they reinforce all kinds of unconscious bias in the minds of police officers who have to actually do the duty of policing people, stopping people, frisking people, pulling people over, etc. Right. And like and also even when it comes to situations where they're going to make a snap decision about whether they're going to shoot somebody or not, right? And it's usually Black, excuse me, and brown people who are disproportionately more likely to be the victims or the negatively impacted by these kinds of things, including but not limited to being shot, killed, being maimed, paralyzed, or harmed in some way because of the altercations, being falsely identified, and also being put in prison, right? Like that bias in policing, right, and the perhaps unintended consequences that come from that, right, that you're using the statistical data to justify, like all of that works together, and you can't have the one without the other. So that's the point that I was making. So until bro comes back, because I don't want to go too far because I'm gonna have to repeat it all. um Let me try to establish some working definitions, and then maybe I can put these in post for the viewers, because the show must go on. All right. So we got some definitions here. We got people of color. I don't need that defined. Systemic racism. Systemic racism emphasizes the involvement of whole systems, and often all systems, for example, political, legal, economic, healthcare, school, and criminal justice systems, including the structures that uphold the systems. Oh, and then we have structural racism that I want to find. So let's see. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that pervasively and deeply embed in and throughout systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, entrenched practices, and established beliefs and attitudes that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment of people of color. Okay. So, like, if you have a culture of policing that leverages FBI statistical data or Department of Justice data that says that, hey, look, there's some trends by which Black people who tend to live, they're disproportionately high to live under conditions of poverty, which are correlated with a lot of crimes, including but not limited to violent crimes, are disproportionately or overrepresented in those violent crimes, partly because or partly as a function of the fact that they live under those conditions of poverty. And you're citing that as justification for over policing those communities. And then as unintended consequences of that over policing of those communities, then those Black people are disproportionately more likely to be in prison, to be shot by police officers, etc. Right? Like those are the unintended consequences of a policy that maybe have started off as well intended, right? And the negative disparate outcomes are what is cited as an example of systemic racism or structural
Yeah.
racism. That's what people mean.
No, I heard until the point that you're talking about stop and frisk and unintended consequences at the tail end. Um, and
Yeah.
that's my argument is that the fact that you have a group of people who are committing more crimes than another group of people based on their percentage of population warrants that they will be policed more than the other groups of people who aren't committing as much crime as them. And the fact that you are going to be policed more, because policing is a matter of priority. So violent crime, for example, takes precedence over nonviolent crime. And so you may not be out there searching for people with weed or nonviolent crime, yet the simple reality that these people are overrepresented in violent crime, the people who live in those areas who happen to participate in nonviolent crime are going to be stopped, searched, are going to be the unintended consequences or the collateral damage of these uh, of obviously over policing, which is not really over policing, it's just policing because they're responding to what is warranted. If you are overrepresented in said crime, whatever crime it is, you can't cry about being policed more because you're committing more crimes. So there's an equal like response to the level of crime that is happening in your area. Just like if you have an area that has virtually no, I live in out here in
Wouldn't
Carmel,
it be more
Monterey
accurate?
area.
Sorry, wait. Are you saying that? Sorry, wouldn't it be more accurate to say that black people are committing a higher percentage of the crimes? That's what you mean by more, right?
Yes,
A higher
yes,
percentage relative to their
disproportionately. Yeah,
population.
yes, correct.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this is not to say, just to be
Okay.
clear to everybody, this
So
is
they're
not
not.
to say that black people are inherently violent. This is also not to say that majority of black people are violent or committing crimes, period. This is to say, by the statistics, if we're going to argue about police response and sentencing and this, that, and the third, you have to look at what is the likely what is the representation of black people in a said crime versus white people in a said crime juxtaposed to their percentage of the population if we're looking at racial impact. I don't even like to do that because I don't think that that's meaningful at all, but if we're going to do it and we're going to say, well, okay,
But
we know that
police
black people are
police
13%.
precincts do this regularly and
Yeah,
have
and I
for
don't think
decades.
I I don't like to divvy things up by race, but hey, the world's doing it, whatever. But
No,
when
but
you
there's a substantive point that I'm trying to get at, which is that this is actually standard practice, and the rationale for it and the justification given for it is precisely the one you're articulating. And what I'm trying to get you to see is the problematic nature of it. Why is it problematic to use that as a justification for what some people would term over policing of certain communities, right? When especially if you're not taking into account what they would also term the root causes, right? Like the conditions of poverty and the relationship, the intimate, inextricable relationship that has to the propensity to committing some of these crimes that we're labeling violent crimes in under these circumstances
yeah,
matters. And
yeah,
that there's
except
that
for the
is a
points
bigger
in
explat. Hold on, wait. That has bigger explanatory weight for why these trends are happening amongst Black people who tend disproportionately to live under these conditions, as opposed to anything about Black people's propensity towards violence, right? But the Black person's propensity towards violence is one of those unintended consequences in terms of manifesting itself as unconscious bias of the people who have to do the policing, right? And so, like, what
no.
I'm saying is that kind of stuff, yes, that kind of stuff contributes to unjustified or questionable police shootings or dealings with Black people in these areas, right? Because they're constantly engaging with example after example after example of a Black person who has done X, Y, and Z, and that's cultivating expectations of Black people's behavior
Yeah, so if that was the
unconsciously in
case,
the
right?
minds of these police officers.
Yeah, if that was the case, then you would actually find a greater propensity of police officers killing black men than you would of black men killing police officers. You don't see that. Okay.
No, that doesn't follow. That doesn't follow.
Okay, so if
Why would you
white
expect that?
okay, well, you're saying that police officers are scared because they see, these black men are out here dangerous, they're killing each other, they don't like interactions with police. They've seen the stories of black people dying at the hands of police, and so they're apprehensive and they would probably kill a black man. Is that your argument or not?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying anything about police officers being more or less likely to kill Black people than Black people are to kill police. What I'm saying is that they're more likely to treat any given Black person that they are likely to encounter as having a special connection with criminality than they
Yeah, I
otherwise
don't.
would. Were these biases not reified by the kinds of justifications you're giving? That's what I'm saying.
hmm Yeah, I don't think that police officers are treating black people writ large as being more dangerous or being more apprehensive. I think that if you're dealing at the point in which a black person who ends up in an interaction with a cop ends up being uh you know aggressive, resisting, all that stuff. Like just being aggressive towards the police officer is the point in which the police officer would probably have a greater guard, you know, and in terms of how they treat them, in terms of worrying about their safety, this, that, and the third. Well, my argument is though, Jason, is that it is reasonable for us to conclude that black people who are overrepresented in every category of violent crime, okay, and even in other crimes, that they would have more police presence in those areas simply because a lot of the times the police are available anywhere is because there's typically more people calling for help in those areas. And so, in order to decrease the response time for those people who are asking for help, you end up with more patrol vehicles who are in those areas to decrease the response times. It's not
I don't think that
unreasonable.
explanation makes sense. I don't think that explanation makes sense. I don't think that there are, well, I mean, I guess in like in general, as a function of there being a higher population in like city areas, you would have more people in a given in a given what in a given area, for lack of a better term, calling for help, and that would justify, I think, having more police available. So it's the concentration of the population more so than a lot of people at like calling the police. I like. I mean, I think.
Well,
Well, I guess those two go
what
hand in hand. You're gonna have more people calling the police if you have more, if you have a higher concentration of people in a certain area. So I guess those go hand in
yeah.
hand. But I think it's a more of a function of population density than it is anything else.
Actually, I think it's a greater function of crime than anything else. I mean,
Well, I actually think
especially
crime
violent
no,
crime.
I think crime generally and violent crime is also a function of higher population density.
Well, okay,
Which is
that
why
could be true,
which is
but
why
it's
the densest populations have, that's where, like, think about the most crime-ridden places in America, they typically have pretty dense populations. Not always, because you have places like St. Louis, which is less dense than places like Chicago. But
mhm.
like they're way more than like, rural areas.
Sure. No,
And I don't know that
I
there's any
agree with
rural.
you there, but you have to ask yourself the question, you have you have cities that don't have as much violent crime as other cities. Why is that? Clearly, because it's different people with different circumstances and different cultures of people. If
Well,
city
I think
A
there's a
has
bunch of different reasons. It's not just
if
one.
city A has the same population as city B, or if city A has a greater population than city B, yet city A has less violent crime than city B, that tells us at least something. It tells us at least that, hey,
Give me an example of that.
I actually
You
don't
want to
have one.
compare
I'm
two
just
cities?
giving you a hypothetical. If city A would have a greater population than city B, yet they had less violent crime than city B, then that tells us that population is not a causal factor. Now, I'm conceding the fact
No, it
that
doesn't. It just tells us that it's not the only causal factor.
that's what I just said. I'm saying that it at least
You said
tells
it's
us.
not a causal factor at all, but, like, I'm saying what it would tell us is that it's not the only causal factor.
No, it actually
So
tells us that it's
it
not.
consistent with
If it is a
everything that,
causal factor, hold on. If it's
no,
a causal factor, then it
consistent with
would
what
be.
you said, no. What? If there's multiple causal factors and you take away one of them, right? You can't really predict or derive an outcome from that because it would depend on how the other causal factors interact.
Okay, so Jason,
So what it would tell us
I
is
think
that
it's
it's not the only causal factor. It wouldn't tell us that it's not a causal factor at
I think
all.
it tells us that it's not. I mean, the fact that you have a city that has a greater if your thesis is a great cities with greater population have greater violent crime than cities with lower populations. If
I
I
said they
find you a
tend to,
city,
but I didn't say universally.
okay, so then
So what I
cool.
said was
Well,
that
we're in
they tend
agreement.
to, and that's true.
Well, yeah. So
Uh,
what I'm saying is that if you have groups of people who are overrepresented in crime or violent crime, it warrants more policing. Do you agree there?
uh, say it again. Sorry, I was doing.
Okay.
Say it again. If
Communities
but
that are riddled with violent crime
mhm.
warrant more policing than communities that are not riddled in violent crime.
um, communities that have instances of violent crime happening, I think would warrant more law enforcement. Yes.
Okay. All
And the
right.
reason why I'm wording it slightly differently is because one of the things that I'm gonna raise, one of the objections I've been meaning to raise to you is whether or not the statistical data is a function of the fact that these areas are over policed in the first place, or if it's a matter of the fact that there's more crime happening in those places. And how would you know otherwise? Meaning, if you had an area hypothetically where like the same amount of crime as one of these over police cities was happening, but you didn't have the law enforcement there to catch it and document it, then how would you know whether or not there was less crime there?
Yeah, because as far as violent crime is concerned, these are calls. So we have 911 records, 911 call records, and we juxtapose those also with uh, specifically with murder, with bodies, because these bodies don't just end up. There's bodies that are found, and then you have cases that are never solved. You have like violent crime cases that go unsolved. Um, but what we know off the data that we do know is, okay, how many murders are happening, how many uh um how many 911 records are being recorded, how many people are calling for help for specific different categories of violent crime. And off of that, we can know, okay, by race and by region, okay, who's making these calls? Um, what's the frequency of these calls being made on a month to month, day to day, year to year basis? And who are the victims and who are the perpetrators? Okay. These data inform our decisions and inform law enforcement on how to better respond in the future to try to act like, to basically try and have better outcomes for these people. So, for example, if you're a cop and you know that, you're a precinct and you know that, okay, majority of all the murders that happen out here happen in this particular town. Guess what you're going to do? You guys are going to centralize around that town, okay, to act as a deterrent to the violent criminals who are running rampant in that town. At least as a presence. Just like when you're driving down the street and you see a cop, most people's instant reaction is to put their foot on the brake to slow down because you don't want to get caught speeding. The same thing happens with violent criminals. When they see law enforcement in the area, it acts as a deterrent. It doesn't stop everyone, but it acts at least as a small deterrent to say, you know what, we got to watch out for this area because we got the ops, right? So
Right,
that's
right.
the thing, is that it's not to say that black people should be policed more. It's just to say that for the vast majority of black people who are completely
Well,
innocent
that is
live.
wait, sorry, isn't that what you're saying? That is what
No,
you're
no,
saying. You're
no.
saying black people
Uh,
should police more because they commit more violent crime.
No, 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 no. I didn't say black people commit more violent crime. I said that black people
Yeah, you
are
did.
overrepresented in violent crime.
Yeah, in every category of violent crime, and
Yes,
that justifies policing those communities.
yes,
That's what you said.
yeah. So, so,
So,
so
so black people should be policed more. Seems to be a natural consequence of everything you're saying. I don't understand how you don't.
black people who live in areas that are riddled with violent crime should be
Mhm.
policed more. Yes,
Okay,
because
so
the
how's that
consequence
not
of
the same as?
because black people who don't live in places with violent crime should not be policed, period. Like, what's the point of
I
policing
yeah no I
people
get
who are
I get I
never?
get that I get
Yeah,
that point, but that to me that's a trivial distinction because you've already identified the fact that in the places where the crimes are happening, the violent crimes are happening, black people are overrepresented.
in
so
the places
so
where
in
crime,
effect, you're saying,
well, okay, so it's like this,
but
right?
in
Like
effect, you're saying
black
black people
people.
should be policed more in general because black people
No,
are
no, no, no,
more
no, no, no,
likely
no.
in
I'm not
general to
saying that.
commit. Hold on,
Don't put
wait,
words in
wait,
my
wait.
mouth.
But in effect, you are though
I'm
because
not.
black people, according to you, are in general. So are black people generally like more likely to commit violent crimes or not?
No, unequivocally no.
Then how are they overrepresented in every statistical category, or excuse me, every category of violent crime? Then
Oh, that's a nuance, but it's a very simple answer to that. It's the fact that the culture surrounding specifically black ghettos is what leads to these horrible consequences that we see as it pertains to violent crime. Like I said, black people are not inherently criminal. They're not inherently violent. They're not inherently negative anything.
no, I can
What
see
I
that. I'm
so
not trying
so
to
so
saddle you
even
with that,
the fact that we have
but you're
majority
you're you're
of
generalizing these trends, though.
but
You
check
can't
this
like,
out though, Jason. Majority of people who live in these inner cities are black. Okay? That is not to say, that's
yeah,
wholly
that's
different from saying majority of black people live in ghettos. That is not true by any stretch. Okay?
I
So,
didn't
yes,
attribute that to you.
sure, but that's what people jump to when they say that black people are just over policed. They generalize. It's like, no, just the ones that live in the inner cities. Okay? And those happen to be the minority of black folks writ large. Okay, so black people who live in inner cities are, yes, overrepresented in terms of everyone who lives in inner city, but in terms of all black people, majority of them don't live in inner cities. But the vast majority of black people who do live in inner cities aren't gangsters, they aren't criminal, they're innocent bystanders who are just going by their day-to-day life. And then they're riddled to having to deal with the small minority of criminals who are making their life a living hell. And so they end up paying for the
But that's what I'm.
ramifications of that.
That's the problem with the argument you're giving, is it implicates a bunch of people, black people, who have the same skin color as the people who are actually committing, the minority of black people who are actually committing the violent crimes, which you cited as a justification for over policing the communities in which these black
Yeah,
people who share their skin color but not their criminal propensities live. And
yeah,
those people are the unintended fallout of these policies. And that's the sense in which this is systemic racism that is
it's
manifesting
not.
itself, because
It's
those
not.
black people, because dude, it implicates black people who are not criminal by your own admission,
It
right?
doesn't implicate them.
And because, yes, it
How am I
does,
implicating them?
because they share the same identity category as the people that provided the justification for more policing in those areas,
They're
right?
not criminals, so they don't share the same identity
I
profile.
know that. No, but yes, they do. They're black.
So black is a criminal identity?
No, it's just an identity. And it's an identity that you use as a justification for over policing black communities. You
That's not what
said
I used.
black
I
people
said,
are overrepresented.
yeah, I
Dude,
said
you
black
said
people are
black people are
overrepresented.
overrepresented in
Yeah,
every category of violent crime, and that justifies
yes,
policing more police to those areas. And what I'm saying is,
correct.
all of the black people that ain't committing crimes, that do live
Hmm.
in those areas, are implicated in that because they're liable to be seen by a police officer who's doing their policing job with
Hmm.
suspicion, because they share the same identity category as the people who are overrepresented in violent crimes.
Hmm. Yeah, except for the
Because
fact
no
that
police officer knows which black person they're looking at. They don't know if they're looking at a violent criminal or if they're looking at a regular Joe Schmo black person. They don't know that yet. Like, so that's what I'm saying. Like, they're implicated in all these policies. So if you have to, like, if you have a
except for something
reasonable
called a
cause or
profile,
a
right?
reasonable suspicion, that's what's problematic about it. It's racial profiling. That's
No,
why it's
no, 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 no.
problematic.
No, I didn't say racial profiling. I just said profiling. Like, in order for you to do effective policing, you have to profile.
Dude,
Like,
that's
you cannot
part,
do
but yeah, but
effective
that's
policing
part of the
without
profiling.
profiling.
But that's part of the profiling,
Yeah,
is the racial
yeah.
profiling.
If you're a
That's a
black
part of the profiling.
criminal, then you should be profiled as a
Right.
black criminal. What's the point of saying white
Cool.
male
But
or
if you
unidentified?
happen to
No.
resemble, hold on. But if you happen to resemble the person or fit the description of the person that they're looking for, then you're
Yeah.
liable to get stopped for that reason, right?
Yeah, and if you're
Right?
white and the same thing applies, yeah, it's the same thing. If you're
Okay,
white
cool.
and
But
you're
what I'm
the,
saying
the
is, hold
profile
on.
is yeah.
Wait. You can't but just hear me out, dude. Because I've been
Uh-huh.
very fair to your point of view. I really need you to hear what I'm saying. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is that is one example where other people who ain't committing crimes are implicated in this policing policy because they
But
are
are you
liable to
saying that
fit the description. Go
uh-huh.
ahead.
Are you saying that those people
They're
those other black people who live there, right? You're saying they're
Mhm.
implicated. I'm saying that they're not
Yes.
implicated. I'm saying even the unintended consequences still doesn't mean that it's not warranted. So the simple fact that you got caught, okay, at a greater rate doesn't mean that it is wrong that you got
No,
caught in
I'm,
the
I'm
first
talking
place.
about false positives. I'm talking about false
Oh, false
positives, which happens a
positives.
lot.
Okay, all right. So
Yes.
for false positives, I condemn all false positives. Okay, like obviously nobody
Okay,
wants to be
but that's
caught
a wait,
for
but that is a direct consequence of the policy that
yes,
you are advocating.
yes. But here's the
So
reason
so
why I
that's the
advocate for that.
unintended consequence.
Uh-huh. The reason why I advocate for it, Jason, is because you have to weigh trade-offs. What would you rather have, Jason? Would you rather have a group of people who are not policed, okay, or who are not policed at the same rate or at a greater rate? What would you rather have? Would you just leave them policed at the same rate as another community that barely has any violent or any crime in general? Or would you rather police them at a greater extent, knowing that some of the ramifications of that is that you will end up with some false positives? Like, well, what is the trade-off?
Well,
End up with
I
some
don't
people that you
I don't
rather
I don't know that
let
those
free
are the
because
only
they
two
actually
options.
didn't commit a crime, or
I
actually
don't know that
police
those are the
more?
only two options.
Okay,
I don't know
give
that
me
those are the only
another
two options.
alternative.
So one standard progressive line is that what we should really be doing is we should be focusing on root causes. What are the root causes of the criminal activity in the first place? And if it's the conditions
Hmm.
of poverty, then what we probably want to do is invest a lot of resources in improving the conditions of poverty, right? And part of that would be to address the systemic factors that contribute to those conditions of poverty, which is what I've been telling you for like 2 hours. That's one argument that we can say. We say, look, like you're looking at a leaky roof that is causing a puddle, and you keep mopping up the puddle, but you're not dealing with the original source of the puddle,
You
right?
remember
And
the
so you're
source I
you're
gave
gonna
you
have to
about
keep.
you remember the source I gave you about Asian Americans in New York City? Okay, you're saying
No,
we need to go back to the root causes, right?
I'm saying that's an alternative to
That's an
the I
alternative,
think the
right?
false dichotomy you gave me.
Yeah,
No, I'm
except I
giving you an
don't think
example of the kind of argument that. Go ahead.
I think they do go to the root cause. I think police are directly diving in a root cause, and that's what they respond to. They're like, okay,
No, the root
what?
cause is the wait. What is the root cause of why there's an increase in criminality in inner city areas like south side of Chicago and like places in Baltimore and like Compton and shit? What are the root causes of that?
Lack of fatherhood is number one, I would say. Lack
Okay.
of
And
father
then what
presence.
causes lack of fatherhood? What causes lack of fatherhood specifically in the black communities?
Lack of fatherhood is caused by several things. One of those things is the simple fact that you have black people who are having children out of wedlock. You have black men who are not committing to their wives or their children. You have
Mm.
black men who are deciding to engage in or not just violent activity, just criminal activity in general. Okay, these things lead
And
to
why are they
bad
doing that?
consequences.
Why are they doing that? Why are black men engaging in criminal activity in these places?
Because of a degradation of the moral framework in their culture. So like the video we were playing earlier, you have an entire community of people that is being that is being fashioned in a way that, hey, in order for us to get things done, or in order for us to really entice people to do things, we have to link these certain things, these elements into it. And you have a situation where the culture of Black America is turning to a point where the utility of having a solid family, the experience of shame in these different categories is waning. And when you have the experience of shame being thrown away by the wayside, to where people don't see the shame in not taking care of your family, the shame in disrespectful children, the shame in all these different things, you end up in a culture of people that ends up in very bad outcomes, unfortunately.
Okay, do you genuinely believe that the reason why only 9% of the white population is below the line of poverty line is because white people value their families more and don't have and have, I guess, the appropriate amount of shame in their
No, I
culture?
don't say, no, I don't think it's the only, I don't think it's the only factor. I think that is one of the factors as to why the white population has ended up in worse outcomes over time. Like for example, the single motherhood rate, and um, the fact that other groups of people are climbing into greater wealth and greater asset accumulation than them is because of better structures that these other groups have. Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Nigerian Americans, like all these different ethnic groups that are coming into this country are coming with prerequisites of better family structures, and they use that as a leverage to catapult their families into success. And so you can you can
You
start
do
off
realize
as
that the divorce rate, you do realize that the divorce rate has been growing steadily among all races, and yet the poverty rate hasn't been following white people. Right? Like, wouldn't you expect if it was a function of families not staying together, that the increase of the poverty rate would correspond or correlate to the increase of the divorce rate?
no. So divorce rate is not as good of a metric as um the point at which of whether somebody was married or never married. Um, the the distinguishing factor here that I'm trying to drive at is the vested interest of both parties. If you have one example, you have two people who are like, I'm gonna live my own life, you're gonna live yours, and then we have this kid in the middle, and we'll just do whatever, right? That's a situation. And then you have this other group, two people who are like, you know what? We're going to be completely committed to this child's life. You're going to have vastly different outcomes. Not in every instance, but in most instances, you'll have the best outcomes coming from two functional parents who are married, living together, raising their children. Okay. Now, it just so happens that white people, just like how black people are affected through welfare, white people are also affected through welfare. And their family structures have actually i- they have declined at a sharp rate. I mean, they were at 5% single motherhood in 1960, and black people are at 25%. And then you have black people now at 70% and white people are at 30%. So you went from 5 to 30%. That's a huge jump in broken families, you know? And so to me, a better factor, or especially when it comes to this policing thing that we're talking about, Jason, is, what would you rather have? I would rather have police officers responding to places that are riddled with violent crime because they have to respond to calls. That doesn't mean all cops respond to all calls. That just means that the vast majority of cops are going to respond to the vast majority of calls when they're made. And it just so happens
Okay,
that
but
some
the only
communities
the
don't.
only point I've been trying to drive home is that there's a whole bunch of intended ripple effects to that kind of policy, which may be well intended, and it seems like it's focused in on the fact that black people, particularly black males, have been identified as disproportionately more likely to engage in certain kinds of violent crimes in these areas. So that's the justification, right, based on the available statistical data, and all of the ripple effects would
Mhm.
be like the mores and the attitudes and the policies that are actually implemented as a result of that. Not only that rationale, but like that stated policy aim in policing, and it disproportionately negatively affects black people as a perhaps unintended consequence, but an undeniable consequence nonetheless. And that's an example of systemic racism that you said didn't exist. That's
Do you
what
think it's
people are
systemic
talking about, and it's not
racism?
just that. It's not. Wait, hold on. And you didn't even touch the thing that I think is even more like difficult to argue against. Yes, I do. I think that's what people mean when they talk about it. But the other thing you didn't touch was the discrepancies in sentencing for the same crimes. So this is at the point where you already have groups of white people, groups of black people,
Hmm.
and those are usually the two groups that are compared, that have committed one and the same crime, but black people are more likely to get harsher sentences for the same crime. How do you explain that? There doesn't
Um,
seem to be a justification for that at all.
well, no. So there actually is a justification for why black people would be sentenced more for some crimes, specifically when it comes to crack cocaine, which is what the
Why?
one people usually jump to. So we know for a
Why?
fact that black people asked for that. Okay, look up the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This is led by people like Charles Rangel, who fought with the Black Congressional Caucus to increase the sentencing for black people because they didn't want their black young males like getting decimated, okay, getting destroyed as the leaders in the community. So they went and fought in Congress to have greater sentencing for black people caught with crack cocaine as opposed to their white counterparts who typically use powder cocaine. And what happened? They got what they asked for. Black people started getting sentenced at a greater rate, not because they were black, but because they actually made it a law that if you caught with crack, you would end up getting sentenced at a greater extent than someone caught with powder. It just so happened that black people use crack more than white people.
Okay, a couple things wrong with what you said. Number one is there's not a single instance of any representatives of the black community, Jesse Jackson types, or anybody else that acts specifically in Congress for harsher sentences for black people, specifically when it comes to criminal offenses generally
I
and
never
drug
said that.
offenses in particular. But you did though.
No, no, no.
You
I said
literally just said
that
that
it was
black
led
people
by black
asked to
greater
have
sentencing.
harsher sentences for black people. That's what you
Harsher
said.
sentencing for people caught with crack cocaine, who just so happen to be more black people than white people. Because,
Okay.
like I said, black people
The
choice of
second thing
drug was
wrong with
crack.
what you said, the second
Mhm.
thing wrong with what you said is even with respect to that crime, black people still get harsher sentences than white people. So there doesn't seem to be a justification. So, like, let's say you're a white person and you get caught with crack, powder crack or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Like, why would you? What
Powder
justification
crack?
is there for you to get
Because it's law. It's
whatever you said?
codified.
Powder.
No, I
Okay,
said
so
okay. So
why?
black
So
people used
why?
crack.
Why
Like
would you, as a white person, not have as harsh a sentence as a black person for that same crime? What
because
justification is there
it's
for that?
for the same crime. So are they using the same thing?
Yes,
Okay.
same crime.
So
Yes,
so is it crack cocaine or powder cocaine? Are we talking about the same one?
I'm saying the same exact crime, dude.
Okay. So
The same
show
exact
me an
crime.
example. Show me an example of a black person and a white person using crack cocaine, okay, with the same priors. Everything is the same. The only difference is skin color, and they got different sentencing. Same behavior in court, same jurisdiction, same judge, same everything, right? Show me that.
That's very unlikely. That's way too specific,
I know
or
it's
way too
very
narrow.
unlikely. Yeah,
But it's
I
no,
know it's very
but it's
unlikely.
unlikely because the parameters are so narrow. Why do they have to have the same judge?
Yeah,
What?
it's important, right? Because if you're
No, that's
making
not important at
hold
all.
hold
What?
on, it's
If they had
important.
different judges, then it wouldn't count.
No, it's important because if you're going to level racism, right? You have a group, you have a person, and a judge is an important person in a courtroom, is wouldn't you say?
Mhm.
Okay. So when
But
you have a
the
judge
judge.
and you say that the judicial system is racist, one of the key people in a courtroom is a judge. And if they're going to make a decision, and some cases aren't even like leveled up to the jury to decide. It's up to the judge's discretion. Okay, you get an option. Would you
Mhm.
rather be represented by a, a group of peers as your jury, or would you rather present your case directly to the judge? Okay, people have options, and when you have a judge who is reviewing your case and listening to the evidence and looking at your behavior in court, seeing whether or not you have remorse, seeing whether or not you're a prior, and you have all these things matter. And if you have different judges, okay, with two different people, you can't say that racism was the factor if you're not looking at the same judge leveling punishment to two different people. It has to be a black
But
person and a white
the
person, the
judges
same
have to
judge.
make their rulings with respect to the same laws, though. So I don't understand why the differences in
I
judges account
agree. I
for
agree.
the
But
differences in racial treatment.
the racism part is okay, you have a judge and you find a black white person, and the judge says, hey, because you're black, okay, I'm going to give you a greater sentencing. And you're white, you're going to get less sentencing. I am yet to
Well, no,
see that
be
example.
no, that would be racist on the part of the judge. But we're talking about the systems. We're talking about the outcomes of the system, right? And
Okay,
also,
so
it's not
if
so
we,
myopic as one particular judge in one particular jurisdiction. We're talking about these things happening at federal level, like nationwide. These are general trends in
yeah,
the U.S.
yep.
So
And
I don't know why
I
you're
do have to
like.
leave
It
here in
just
like
feels
five
unfair
minutes.
for you to. All right, cool.
You got to
I'll
go.
end with
But
this then.
yeah.
So here's a source I have about racial disparity in sentencing from the
Hmm.
Open Society Foundations. This was written in 2005. So this is a history of racial disparity in criminal justice system in the U.S. and has been long-standing. The racial dynamics in sentencing have changed over time and reflect the move from explicit racism to more surreptitious manifestations and outcomes. In this publication, the Sentencing Project reviews the research literature of the past 20 years on racial disparity in sentencing, organizing the findings into 6 issue areas. So you have some key findings in terms of direct racial discrimination. There's evidence of direct racial discrimination against minority defendants in sentencing outcomes. Evidence of direct discrimination at the federal level is more prominent than the state level. Blacks are more likely to be disadvantaged in terms of sentencing length and the federal level, whereas Latinos are more likely to be disadvantaged in terms of decision to incarcerate. At the state level, both Latinos and Blacks are far more likely to be disadvantaged in the decision to incarcerate or not, as opposed to the decision regarding sentence length. Incarceration of race, ethnicity, other offender characteristics. Key findings. Young Black and Latino males tend to be sentenced more severely than comparably situated white males. That's an example of what I was talking about. Employed Black males tend to be sentenced more severely than comparably situated white males. Excuse me, unemployed Black males tend to be sentenced more severely than comparably situated white males. Let's see. Interaction, indirect effects of race, ethnicity. I don't care about that. Interaction of race, offender, victim, interaction of race, ethnicity, type of crime. So, key findings: Latinos and Blacks tend to be sentenced more harshly than whites for lower level crimes such as drug crimes and property crimes. However, Latinos and Blacks convicted of high level drug offenses also tend to be more harshly sentenced than similar situated whites. Capital punishment. In the vast majority of cases, the race of the victim tends to have an effect on the sentence outcome, with white victims' cases more often resulting in death sentences. However, in some jurisdictions, notably in the federal system, the race of the defendant also affects sentencing outcomes, with minority defendants are more likely to receive a death sentence than white defendants. So you
Mhm.
only have some jurisdictions where black and brown people, or I guess non-white people, are more likely to receive the death penalty. But there's some, in the vast majority of cases, white victims are more likely to be to receive capital punishment. So that's a discrepancy against white people. All the other ones were favoring white people. Um, so I'm reading just the bullet points because you got to go. I was actually going to go and back into the data. I wish I had time to do so. Do a part two if you want to, because I don't want to shy away from that.
Yeah,
But that's the
let's do
kind of
that.
thing that people have in mind when they're talking about racial discrepancies in sentencing. Um,
Mhm.
so there doesn't really seem to be a justification for the general trend whereby black and brown people are more likely to receive harsher penalties for the same offenses by comparison to their white counterparts. Even if it's true that black and brown people are overrepresented in some categories of crime, like when you're comparing a population of black and brown people who've committed a crime and the population of white people who committed a crime and been convicted, there doesn't seem to be a justification for discrepancies like that in sentencing. So, like, that's what I was kind of offering to you as a challenge of like where the justification was. You seem to hone in very myopically on like, the judge or something, or policy positions that black people advance, like what ushered in the mass the era of mass incarceration in the 1994 crime bill, which was supported by the black community. Those are examples to steel man you somewhat, but that doesn't explain the discrepancies in sentencing writ large across the United States.
Yeah, so I'm not here to make an argument about zero discrepancy in the justice system. Justice system is not perfect, all right? Um, and I'm not going to use that as a crutch for my argument. All I'm saying is that the fact that we know for a fact that black people are overrepresented in violent crime across the nation in every category at least tells us that we should reasonably expect them to be overrepresented based on their percentage of the population, likewise, in prison. It shouldn't be come as a surprise that, oh, well, black people are clearly overrepresented in all these different crimes, but we didn't expect them to be overrepresented in prison. That doesn't make any sense. What we know is that they are overrepresented in prison, but the question people never ask is, well, did they actually commit the crimes that they're being put in prison for, or are they just being unjustly put there? Now, look, if you have evidence to say that tells us that white people and black people who have the same everything and the only difference is skin color uh, uh, is causing the disparity in sentencing. That is clear evidence of systemic racism or just racism. Period. Right? In the justice system, and will fight with you against that.
But
You
why
know,
is what I
but
pointed out not clear evidence of that? Why does
well,
it have to be
well,
so
I don't
myopically?
understand
Why
what
why
this
does everything except the skin color have to be the same for you to concede this?
because if skin color is the only thing that you can see viscerally as the difference and you haven't accounted for all the other things, then yeah, like that is a poor way of judging a system on whether or not it's racist. Because if you're looking at a system and you just see a disparity between the races and you jump to racism, it's just as silly as looking at disparity between the genders and jumping to sexism being the problem. Like we know that
No, but
majority
the
of
but
people
the
in prison
tactic,
are men. It's not
but the
sexist.
strategy, but I want to be clear about my logic. My logic was there doesn't seem to be a justification for discrepancies in sentencing writ large between blacks and whites once you have a population of whites and a population of blacks that
Mhm.
have both committed the same crime. That's all you need, right?
I need to
All of
see
the other
that. I
things that you're
haven't
trying to
seen that.
account for are extra.
Yeah, I haven't
Well,
seen.
that's
What I'm
what
trying
this
to
is
say
about.
is,
So I mean, I could send this to you if you want me to. Like,
no, no, no.
all right,
I
we can do
want
a
to
part two.
see.
We can do a
So
part two. We can do a part two.
right, right, right. Because this says like there's evidence of direct racial discrimination against minority defendants in sentencing outcomes. And then it said something about comparable situations. I want to see what those comparable situations are. I want to see clear evidence that black people and white people are committing the same crimes. They have the same priors, they're in the same jurisdictions, and they have completely different disparities. Like I want to see that. Okay, because even geographical locations have different laws with different sentencing parameters. So if you're cherry picking what you want just to find a massive disparity, like people who live in California versus people who live in Missouri, for example, and you take those two demographics and you say, well, see, yeah, black people are getting, well, yeah, but where are they living and what are the penalties of where they're living versus the white people who are they're being judged against? Those are the kinds of nuances that I'm trying to drive at, because the level charge of racism is huge, right? Systemic racism. That means that
No, I understand what you
majority
mean.
of
I
black
understand what you
people
mean.
wouldn't.
You're not wrong. Yeah, you're not wrong to want to account for like distinctions in jurisdiction, uh, and things like that. Now there's a pretty like substantial literature on this, and that has accounted for those kinds of things. But you're not
Yeah, I
wrong
hope
to want to
so.
ask those questions, because it's the fact that those things have been accounted for is at least some evidence that those things need to be accounted for. So that's fair.
Yeah.
And I don't have the time to do it today because
Let's do
that
part
would have been
two.
my next move.
Let's do part two.
All right, we will do part two.
Because
So with that, we're gonna wrap up. And I was nice to you today. I'm not gonna be nice next time. You get one freebie.
I didn't ask for you to be nice to me today.
uh, I don't want to scare you away like I scared Ibrahima.
I'm not
But
scared. It's
yeah.
all right.
All right. Well, go ahead and give your goodbyes to my audience, if you wouldn't mind,
Cool.
good sir.
Yeah. Guys, thank you for tuning in. This is the Black Muse podcast by Jason. He's a great guy. Met him on Clubhouse. Great conversations. He pushes you to think, and I appreciate you, Jason, for putting me on and having me as your guest. It's been awesome. I love the disagreement. We're always respectful to one another, so that's something that I think, it's a lesson that should be learned, not just on Clubhouse, but just throughout the nation. I mean, you can have people with completely opposite viewpoints, but as long as you're willing to sit across, even virtually, and just have a conversation respectfully, that's that's meaningful. That helps. So I appreciate you. I'll see you on part two, and thanks guys for tuning in.
Yeah. Appreciate you, man. I'm gonna go ahead and bring you off and then close it up.
All right.
I'll be there in a second. All right. Another episode of the Black News Podcast. We did a deep dive. We're gonna do a part two real soon. I definitely have vehement disagreements with bro, but I do like the fact that we can stay respectful even though we disagree vehemently with each other. But yeah, you tuned into another episode of the Black Muse Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse. And until next time, peace.